anything on a vintage.
Charles J. Haughey brought charisma and controversy to Irish politics. He inspired devotion and provoked division like few others.
Grown men would be terrified of him.
He was smarter than everybody else. He was better than everybody else.
This is a story of ambition.
It had excitement, skullduggery, loyalty, disloyalty.
Achievement.
He put in the roots for the Celtic Tiger.
And disgrace.
Tell me the fucking truth. How much do you fucking owe?
Who needs 8.5 million?
Of course it's corruption. You can't do that.
Like, geez, if I'm going down, others are going to go down.
Haughey dominated his party and his country for a quarter of a century. His life defined our times.
There will never be a time like it again. Never such excitement, never such achievement, never such heartache, never such happiness as the time they'll talk of as the Haughey era.
Charles Haughey was famously the man from God knows where. On the campaign trail, his origins were tactically vague. He was a Northsider, a Mayo man, a son of Kerry. But this is where his story really begins. The isolated townland of Swatragh in County Derry.
My father and mother were both from County Derry. They were South Derry, which was a very Republican area. And my father was very involved, both of them actually were very involved in the War of Independence. My mother was in the Coming on. My father was in the old IRA and definitely was a local hero. But there were a lot of things about, like my father supposed to have held up the RUC barracks in the local town of Mahara on his own with an unloaded revolver.
Serving with the IRA's Northern Brigade, Johnny Haughey had a tough war. Fenian Swatragh, as it was known, was deep inside Unionist territory. Haughey spent the War of Independence keeping one step ahead of the law.
They come up the river to avoid the scents of the dogs because they've been constantly hunted by the black and tans. There was a price in his head. Now this is all that's left of the actual dugout. It doesn't look like much now. It's even hard to find, but as you can imagine, it'd be very hard to find in them years. Now it's about 8 metres by 8 metres. He actually lived in this here, and there could have been up to 8 men spent time in this. He used it for about 7 years. In fact, they'd say that it affected his health in later years.
During the conflict, Johnny Haughey was courting local girl Sarah McWilliams. The couple planned to marry, but with Johnny on the run, they had a decision to make.
It would have been impossible for him to have got married in the north. So they had to make a plan to get out of the 6 counties, and they went to Donegal and got married there. So that certainly wasn't an easy start to their married life.
The Haughey's left the north for good, a snap decision that would change the course of Irish politics. Johnny followed his hero Michael Collins into the new Free State Army.
Haughey's unit was only a small unit in South Derry. A lot of those people, they were absorbed into the Irish Army, even though they mightn't have been pro-treaty at the time. They had no other livelihood.
On September 16, 1925, Sarah gave birth to their 3rd child, Charles James, at a Free State barracks in Castlebar. It was an unusual start in life for a future leader of Fianna Fáil.
There was nothing, really, you know. I mean, his mother was left high and dry, really, you know.
My father was an invalid as long as I can remember, and very seriously incapacitated. You know, as a matter of fact, I never saw my father working.
Shortly before settling in the North Dublin suburb of Donnycarney, Johnny Haughey was struck down by multiple sclerosis. Haughey's childhood was dominated by his father's illness. His mother struggled to raise 7 children on a small army pension.
It was tough for her.
It wasn't even for a walk. Ran had to carry him down the stairs on her shoulders down onto the kitchen. Saw her doing it.
It was hard times. His mother was a great woman, really. She was a very strong woman. And she put them all through school. They all got to secondary school on scholarships.
In 1938, Haughey, as he was known, came first in the Dublin Corporation scholarship exams.
They were all clever. All the Haughey's were coming down with brains. They were all very clever.
The scholarship gained Charlie a place at St. Joseph's, a Christian Brothers school in Fairview. Despite the troubles at home, Haughey shone at Joey's, a star in the classroom and on the sports field.
In school, he was up to all kinds of mischief, but he was courageous, he was clever, he was confident. Some people would even say he was crafty. As far as the football and hurling was concerned, anybody who was playing with him who wasn't putting it in, he'd run down to them and say, listen, if I see that fella that you're marking hitting you again, I'll deal with you at half time. That's the kind of a guy he was. He wasn't there just for the fresh air. He was there to win.
St. Joseph's groomed the sons of Fianna Fáil's ruling class. Haughey's classmates included his future political rival, George Colley.
I remember my aunt talking about Charlie Haughey when he was in his glory days, and remembering him as a boy running up and down from Donnycarney to Joey's school in rather bedraggled trousers. George Colley, who was in Joey's with him, was always impeccably turned out. So perhaps there was even a sense of Haughey feeling an outsider within the Christian Brothers ambience.
At Joey's, Haughey met Harry Boland, a member of another Fianna Fáil dynasty. They formed a friendship that was to survive through the decades, despite the Civil War divide between their families.
We were getting ready for the exams, and he said, well, you come on up to the house and we'll look over some of the notes. So when I went into the house, the first thing I saw was this picture of Michael Collins in that army uniform, and it was red rag through a ball as far as bowlings were concerned. And I didn't know, quite honestly, whether I should turn on my heel and go out again. But I didn't anyway, I stayed there.
Top of his class, Haughey was conscious of his clout within the school, and he wasn't afraid to use it.
George Lyons was a new teacher in the school, and he was standing there very prim and proper. Charlie came slightly late after lunch, as was his wont, and flung open the door. And then when he came in, he just put his heel to the door and slammed the door shut with his heel. And George just grimaced and let it go.
Was he a likeable guy? Well, I don't know whether you'd gone a long train journey with him at that stage, if you know what I mean. And at times he could be bloody obnoxious, I can tell you. I saw him in action before against a big guy who is now a Monsignor and was kind of a guy that nobody would take on, but not CJ. Charlie just went into him and took jumps at him, and halfway through the jumps he got a clatter and he was put back sitting on his backside, but he got up again, and you think he stopped getting up? No, he would keep going until he dropped.
Haughey continued to move up in the world with a scholarship to University College Dublin. In the autumn of 1943, a handful of Joey's boys entered the gates of Earlsfort Terrace.
When I arrived in with this, there was a group of Joey's boys and all this other crowd that seemed to own the place in Castleknock and Belvedere and Clongowes and all those.
He would have felt himself surrounded by people from the Jesuit colleges. His famous antagonist, Gareth Fitzgerald, was after all a Belvedere boy, and though Belvedere is technically on the north side, psychically it's a south side school.
Well, there's a north side, south side difference between us. My group of friends and his were quite different. He seemed to spend his time at the beginning always with other men, And that seemed to me a terrible waste of time. So I was with girls rather than men.
Garrett, I suppose we looked on him as a sissy, you know, more than anything at the time, because I remember Garrett, I remember seeing him with an umbrella, like he had an umbrella when the rest of us were lucky to have a raincoat, you know.
Haughey had little time for the rituals of university life. He may have felt like an outsider, but he showed no sign of it to the college authorities.
On one occasion, Charlie, who would normally be counted on to be in the back of the class, was up in the front by coming in at the last minute. And he sat there and he didn't take any notes. And finally the professor looked down and said, "Mr. Haughey, why are you not taking notes?" And Charlie looked up and he said, "Professor," he said, "I have an excellent memory." And the professor looked down and he said, "Mr. Haughey, I forecast no future whatsoever for you."
I mean, he was obviously ambitious from the word go. I suppose we all were. But he was particularly ambitious, and I'm sure that was probably because he was determined to show the world that he could triumph over early difficulties and become what he became.
Haughey showed little interest in politics at UCD. His circle of friends, though, were overwhelmingly drawn from the ruling party and included the eldest daughter of Sean Lemass.
Maureen Lemass was a very nice person, much admired by all of us, and obviously very much admired by Charlie, and that developed into a relationship quite early in our college career.
Charlie may have seen some advantage to it. I remember that theory being talked about at the time, and I had very little time for it, for the simple reason that anybody who thinks that all a man had to do was make a pass at Maureen Lemass, be nice to her, and then pop the question, had no idea what Maureen Lemass was really like. She was a very strong-willed woman.
Haughey got his first taste of leadership during the war. As a second lieutenant, he raised his own platoon of part-time soldiers from the streets of Donnycarney.
They were affectionately known as the Haughey's Fusiliers. Yeah, he was the lieutenant. I think even there he kind of showed a bit of initiative. He kind of got a lorry or something, whether it was army property or not, I don't know. But we had the lorry when others didn't have it.
Haughey's Fusiliers would form the core of a tough, loyal team of Northsiders that Haughey would rely on throughout his political career.
I think when you get a natural leader like that, you tend to get people to follow blindly or not follow blindly, as the case might be. You don't get neutrality, you get people either with or not with you.
In May 1945, as the war in Europe ended, Haughey played a leading role in an incident that grabbed international headlines.
On VE Day, students in Trinity had rung up on their main flagpole 3 flags, one under the other. The top one was the British flag, the second was the American flag, and the third was the Irish flag. And this was regarded as a great insult to the Irish flag. And somehow or other the word got going in college that we'd better go down and do something about this. That march was led by Charlie.
Haughey was seen climbing the flagpole to tear down the British flag.
At that stage, the Garda who was in charge ordered a baton charge. And I'd say that I've seldom seen some of my colleagues run as fast as they ran that evening.
I was in town celebrating, and I discovered that there was some kind of a riot or something going on College Green because Charlie Haughey had taken down flags flying over Trinity with a baton charge, and we escaped by jumping over bicycles and going up Trinity Street. But obviously my views and his would have been different. I was strongly pro-Allied, as my friends would have been. I don't think he shared that view at all.
In the class of 1946, Charles Haughey graduated with a first-class degree in commerce.
It was the time when the sons of the founding fathers of the state were all sort of coming of age.
There was a general
feeling of despondency. I felt it very, very much. Everybody was wondering, had independence, all the blood and toil and all that had gone into achieving independence, whether that had been worthwhile.
This was the world that Haughey set out to conquer. First, the professions. He qualified as an accountant and then as a barrister. Harry Boland got him a job with the family's accountancy firm, but even then, Haughey was thinking big.
We were in Dawson Street when my brother had the office, and he was working away on something, and he was whistling, and he felt me looking at him, and he looked up and he said, more or less, "Shut up, Boland. Don't you know that all famous men whistle tunelessly?"
In 1950, the two men decided to go into business together. Haughey Boland's first office was on Dane Street, above O'Callaghan's, a gentleman's outfitters that catered for the well-to-do.
And the first apprentice that they took on as a trainee accountant was a man called Des Traynor, to whom Haughey became very quickly very close. Haughey became successful in the accountancy practice and was very good what we might now call networker, in getting to know people and getting them to give him business.
Charlie's showed a spark. He's an accountant, he's a barrister. He's got style, but huge intelligence. And it was spotted by the other intelligent people at the time that he had it.
At Joey's, Haughey had earned a reputation as a scrapper. Now he planned to fight his way into the toughest game in town. In 1948, Charles Haughey finally joined Fianna Fáil.
A lot of the old stagers in Fianna Fáil were just getting a little bit on, I suppose, and it was obvious that it was time to get new blood. So one way or another, I must have been speaking to CJ, and I said, so that he just came down and joined and was accepted, of course.
But Haughey wasn't content to lick envelopes and put up posters. In a party dominated by Civil War veterans, his drive and obvious ambition marked him out.
I remember somebody saying, "He's not a wet day in the organisation yet," when he was standing for the council. And somebody else was nominated because they had been so many years there, man and boy,
He didn't tolerate fools easy or at all. He was interested in getting a job done in the constituency. If there was something wrong, he was about getting it resolved, not having meetings to talk about how terrible it was. And that certainly was a view I got from all of the older people that knew him in the 50s. They all admired him as a person. They mightn't have all liked him.
He was abrasive. He was a guy who had a great sense of himself, his own position. He was very assertive, somewhat forbidding.
Haughey gained a place on Dublin Corporation, but a seat in the Dáil proved a tougher proposition. The local Fianna Fáil ticket was sewn up by two TDs with impeccable war records, including the father of George Colley.
There might have been just a little bit of friction over that, a little bit more than a little bit of friction. You must remember, like, Harry Colley was one of the heroes of the GPO. I mean, he had something like 40 wounds in his body, and he was the TD for the area.
By 1957, Haughey had been defeated in 3 straight elections to the Dáil. As that year's poll approached, Haughey knew his only chance of winning was to overthrow the old guard.
It was one of those famous elections, which I forget how many counts there was, but it was an enormous number of counts.
Charlie Haughey, a political unknown who had failed to get elected several times previously, actually took the seat away from Harry Colley, and that must have really hurt a lot of people's feelings and angered a lot of the older men.
I was very upset at the time, and I remember somebody more or less said, "That's your friend now that's put out Harry Colley."
Haughey's seat in the Dáil had come at a price. It set him at odds with George Colley. Tensions between the two men would define Fianna Fáil for the next 25 years.
The wheels are rolling in Ireland today. Machines, goods, and money are on the move.
Haughey entered the Dáil on the cusp of enormous change. Sean Lemass, taking the reins from De Valera, was beginning a program of rapid modernization.
We are now ready with a big new housing scheme which will sweep away the slums in city and country.
Haughey was well placed to exploit this new direction, both with his business connections and his marriage to the new Taoiseach's daughter.
Don't put back the clock now. Let Lamass lead on to victory.
Mr. Aiken and people like Mr. Childers and people of that stature disliked Mr. Haughey. There's absolutely no question about that. And there was a section of the party that disliked him, and I have no doubt that that dislike was returned.
A lot of it is snobbery. Here was this fella from north side Dublin, without great roots and everything else anyway, and chattering classes don't like it. Didn't like it. Why? He was smarter than everybody else. He was better than everybody else.
Politically, Haughey was a moderniser. Privately, he had old-fashioned tastes. Even as a struggling accountant, Haughey was hunting, sailing and collecting art, all on an apparently modest income.
We both took the same amount of money out of Haughey Bone, which was little enough at that stage, very little. Don't know how he did it, but he did it.
Even then, Haughey's lifestyle depended on his links to businessmen. In 1959, millionaire property developer Matt Gallagher gave Haughey inside information about Grangemore, a house with 45 acres of land that was in line for rezoning.
Charles Haughey was rearing a young family. It was the same type of advice that one would give to a friend in a pub. Just going by that, if my thinking comes through correctly, you can't sell it to anybody else. You have to sell it to me.
The secret arrangement to buy Grangemore now and sell to Gallagher later would one day bring Haughey a huge financial windfall. In the meantime, Grangemore was the start of his new life as a country gentleman.
He used to bore a stiff. He'd come in and look out the window. He had started growing lettuce, I think, at this stage. And he'd say, "This is terrible weather for us farmers." He used to walk out in disgust when he'd say that.
He felt entitled to a significant style of living, and that he was head and shoulders above most of his contemporaries in politics, and that he should be able to live with grace and dignity and enjoy all the things that the ascendancy enjoyed in the past.
Haughey is like the great Gatsby. He began as simple Jimmy Gatz, and he just bumped into a rich businessman, and then it all happened. And he remakes himself as J. Gatsby. He self-invented.
Despite the misgivings of some, Haughey's ability was too great to be overlooked, not least by his father-in-law. In 1960, he was appointed to a junior post in the Department of Justice.
Justice was a very, very dusty, backward, obscure place. It's the kind of place you'd almost be afraid of to venture in for fear you'd never find your way out. The thing about civil servants is, if you're just the average useless idiot, they'll take you over.
Comprehensive, just set of rules to govern the passing of all property on death.
Up to the time of the Succession Act, I mean, the woman of the house had no claim whatsoever. And generally what happened was when the son got married, there was a settlement made with the mother, There was phrases in the agreement like that she would have the use of the fire, you know. And it was Charlie Haughey introduced that.
He essentially abolished the death penalty. He set up the military courts for the IRA, and the IRA gave up their campaign immediately. He was very creative and imaginative in a way that had not really been seen for a long time in Irish politics.
Haughey was as glamorous a politician as Ireland had in the 1960s. Even then, he showed an unusual attitude to paying tax.
Came into me and he said, "You wouldn't believe this," he said, but he threw this check across to me, or this chit across to me, and he said, "They took so much off my salary, get it back." So that was the kind of attitude that I think he had.
It's more a comfort to look close, John, eh? Shin Mavine and Eric Pokiaka.
He was busy saving the country, and you look after that.
In contrast to Haughey, his fellow minister George Colley was cultivating an altogether different image.
What is happening in other areas. We will succeed in teaching Irish very effectively, and I would hope with much less trouble than we have heretofore.
The Joey's boys were both regarded as leaders in waiting. But with his promotion to agriculture in 1964, Haughey was ahead in the race for the top job. But this smooth rise through the ranks was about to take a knock.
It was a very fraught and a very tense time. But there was a sit-down outside the Department of Agriculture. Here were these guys camped on the steps of the department, rolled up in sleeping bags and drinking soup.
In agriculture, Haughey became embroiled in a bitter row with the powerful farmers' lobby over falling cattle prices.
The demands that were being made were, in his view, exorbitant and, unrealizable demands. It was as simple as that. Haughey didn't actually meet them.
For the first time in his career, Charles Haughey was caught off balance, portrayed as being out of step with rural Ireland. The protests couldn't have come at a worse time for the ambitious minister. In 1966, the leadership of Fianna Fáil suddenly came up for grabs.
I'm convinced that it's in the interests of the country and of the government and of the Fianna Fáil party that that responsibility should now pass to a younger man.
It can be very difficult to get finger marks. Lifting the lid on Ireland's crime wave. A new series of cracking crime begins Tuesday at 9:30 on RTE1.
See where it says 1759?
Yeah.
You know, a lot of people are under the illusion that that's the year that Arthur Guinness first established his world-famous brewery.
That's what I always thought myself.
No, Bond, you see, that's where you're wrong. 1759 is actually the time of day that Arthur poured his first pint.
1759?
1759. A minute to 6. The Angelus man, sure, he had to stop halfway through, hence the famous two-part pour.
Is that right?
Fact.
When used as part of a balanced diet, Dairy Gold Heart can reduce cholesterol by an average of 10%. That's because it contains natural plant sterols, which work by blocking the absorption of cholesterol into the body. Consider it nature's answer to lowering cholesterol. Dairy Gold Heart, the taste of dairy.
Now this is an inch and a half inch by...
We're setting a date once the two families have met.
You tie it around like this, poke it through a hole and stick it in your fiance's eye.
I didn't think. Oh, look at that hussy.
Embarrassing to try. And he's looked after most of the biggest names in British boxing over the past 20 years, including Bruno, Ben, Nassim Hamid and Eubank. Welcome to Frank Warren.
And we've even got legends in our audience. Will you welcome, please, former world champions Frank Bruno and Steve Collins.
Well, if you want to disagree with Sir Henry Cooper or indeed any of our panellists, you can text the word comment followed by what you want to say to 81106 or email us at legend@sky1.co.uk.
Well, now, let's start with the general vital theme. Henry, what do you think it is, what have you decided it is, that makes a good boxer great, a great boxer? What's the key?
Well, basically, all boxers have got to have a good brain. Yes, you wouldn't be in the game if you didn't. Then you've got to know the basics and the fundamentals of boxing, I think, and punching, or name whatever you want. Certain people put boxing, and when I say boxing, I mean a man who stands up with your left hand and jabs and moves and boxes, and then you've got the fighter, who's the guy who comes forward at you every second or 3 minutes and makes it into.
EBS, altogether better.
Hot noodle. It's all me, 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 me.
Life's full of choices. And like many women during the menopause, I take Imea, which contains natural phytoestrogens. Imea, for the time of your life.
If you have children or are planning to, Family Plan Plus is the tailored healthcare package for you. Life stage choices from VHI Healthcare.
When you need us, we're there.
Buy an 05 Nissan Micra, Almira, or Primera now and get a brand new 06 model next year, absolutely free. No wonder everybody's doing a double take at Nissan's amazing double take offer. At your local Nissan dealer now. Nissan Dealer Network. Drive a better deal.
In '66, when John Lemass retired, Charlie Haughey went forward for leadership, so did George Colley. There was a history between them. They had been in the one constituency. There were the new Tigers at Fianna Fáil, and there was going to be a vote.
While Haughey and Colley shared a past, they appeared to offer the party two very different futures. Haughey was the arch-moderniser, impatient with Civil War politics. George Colley seemed more in step with the party faithful.
He was a man they understood, George Colley. He was the same type of man as they were, as De Valera and Lemass, the very same type of man, you know, with the same principles, the same view of the party.
George didn't like Charlie more than Charlie didn't like George. George Colley honestly felt Charlie Haughey was not the man of integrity that the country deserved.
The threat of a divisive contest now threw the party into real confusion. Fianna Fáil had never faced a leadership contest before.
When Deb had stepped down at 59, it was automatically assumed for the previous 30 years that Lemass would take over. There was no thinking about it.
You were going to have a very bitter contest, and we were almost anxious, very anxious, and so was Sean Lemass anxious, that such a contest would be avoided.
As Haughey and Colley jostled for position, another minister was quietly gaining ground. Jack Lynch, better known for his battles on the sports field than in the Dáil, emerged as a compromise candidate.
Leadership at Fianna Fáil prevailed upon Jack Lynch, and Jack was very reluctant to assume leadership. Would he let his name go forward to avoid a big bloodbath?
We had to beg him. We had to put forward the arguments that he was to avoid this clash at all costs, because there would be no winners and that Fianna Fáil would be a very big loser.
Lemass saw what was building up was a really disastrous situation, not just Haughey versus Colley, but the possible entry into the race of Neil Blaney or Kevin Boland or both. So he got Lynch to stand. He forced him to stand.
I think it was significant that he didn't advance the claims of the son-in-law.
With Lynch in the race, Haughey beat a tactical retreat. Colley alone pushed it to a vote and was trounced. But by choosing Jack Lynch, the party had only postponed the real contest.
When Lynch was elected, they looked on him in much the same way as John the 23rd was looked on, as a very short-term, harmless holder of an office for a brief interval until someone more substantial came along. Well, like John the 23rd, Jack Lynch proved to be much tougher than many of his opponents or his detractors.
Haughey was rewarded for putting his leadership ambitions on hold. Lynch promoted him to finance, then run by the powerful civil servant T.K. Whitaker.
When he became Minister for Finance, he was the first minister I had who was younger than myself. As Secretary of the Department of Finance, my job is to oppose nearly everything, however nice it might seem.
I don't think Haughey was the type of guy that would tolerate the machinations of a Sir Humphrey type, because he would listen very attentively to advice given by civil servants, but then he would evaluate it and, you know, put his own stamp on it, and of course bring in the political dimension to it.
I remember once when the then Governor of the Central Bank sent a very critical letter. The Governor referred to the Central Bank as the monetary authority, and Mr. Haughey stood up in his chair and said, "I am the monetary authority."
We're not taking no for an answer. Okay.
Whitaker and his strong-willed minister soon clashed over Haughey's decision to give free public transport to pensioners.
I was opposed to it, but I warned him, once you start that sort of thing, there's no knowing where you can stop, because there's so many other free gifts you can make available, and people begin to expect them. But I benefited, of course, from it in the end by myself, and in fact, bless him for it.
I think it did come from a deep sense of concern for poor people, because after all, he had known that life in his early days. But I think he probably believed that people of exceptional abilities were entitled to exceptional wealth, and that may be how he could square in his own conscience the possession of great wealth with these intermittent acts of kindness to the poor and the vulnerable.
By the late 60s, the links between Fianna Fáil and business had become ever closer and were formalised through a discreet fundraising group called Haughey.
The idea was that these people would pay £100 a year, and we would have functions during the year to which we would invite ministers. Here was successful business people who could meet with ministers, where they could let them know what they were doing wrong.
Some clown got it into his head that they should have secret dinners and bring them in the side door into the Gresham, so as the media wouldn't know anything about it. The surest way to get printed in the paper is to go underground and everything. And eventually, a whole thing built up about Haughey, and they were into all sorts of deals. Same as every party had, we had a few there on the make.
While Haughey attracted the attention of journalists, Haughey had quietly built his own support network of influential businessmen.
That would be the likes of Mr. Pascal Vincent Doyle, my father, and others unknown to me.
He chose to go into politics. The salary at the time was pretty small. I think that people saw that he was doing the job for the country that needed to be done, and they were happy to support him, to give him the extra luxuries and things, on the basis that he was doing what needed to be done to get the economy right. And so I think people gave it with a whole heart. I don't think there was anything wrong with that.
Even if Charles Haughey says he did nothing for them, it still created the position where he was beholden to them.
Haughey had much to be grateful for. In 1969, his deal with Matt Gallagher paid off. Haughey sold his land at Grangemore to the developer for nearly 20 times what he had paid for it a decade before.
When the time came, my father bought it back off him again. That was a better deal for the Gallaghers than it was for the Haughey's, may I say it that way.
With the proceeds, Haughey bought Abbeyville, a Gandon-designed mansion on over 200 acres in North Dublin. Abbeyville was just a few miles from Donnycarney, but a world away from Haughey's childhood.
Oh, it was a sort of a rambling old house with lots of trees and sort of woodlands around it. And we had a great time there. We always had Irish wolfhounds and various dogs of every shape and size. And I had a pony, and like all the ups and the downs and the trials and the tribulations and the successes and the celebrations, there was always people in Abbeyville.
Haughey had added a stud farm in Meath to his estate in Kinseely. Even in more deferential times, the spectacle of a government minister living in such style prompted questions.
I prefer to be criticised, evaluated, praised, if you like, blamed on anything I do as a public person in my public office. I resent very much my private and personal affairs being the subject of a political campaign. What are you laughing at, my friend?
All can see a spectacular change psychologically from the young man who grew up in ordinary surroundings, probably liked a packet of Woodbines or a pint, to an ascendancy figure who liked horses and champagne and so on. There is a big psychological question there as to how that transition occurred.
There was something in his makeup that said that he didn't want to experience poverty again. His father died of multiple sclerosis at the age of 48, and things couldn't have been easy. So I would certainly think that his desire to have a good life is based on the poverty of his childhood.
The great pity about him is that there was that flaw in him, right? Insecurity. What he wanted most of all was to be seen to be respectable, and thought he could buy that. And you couldn't in that Ireland, right?
The big house may have been a status symbol, but Haughey's fascination with the arts was genuine. A hinterland that provided a refuge from politics.
This day I went up anyway, and he said, "Come in here and I'll show you." And he had some symphony on the radiogram. What do you think of that? I don't think Charlie had an awful lot of music in his makeup. He was able to discuss the symphony, and latterly he was able to discuss all sorts of other things like art and that. And I admired him that this was something that he was going to be talking about, in socially or whatever, and that he made it his business to make some study of it.
As Minister for Finance, Haughey used his position to become a patron of the arts, pushing through a special tax exemption for artists and writers in 1969.
It's the idea, the attempt to show sympathy and create a sympathetic environment for the artist. I think that's what's important.
I think its most important effect was the way it transformed the atmosphere in the country, and the writer and the artist, people came to see that they made a valid contribution to life. There were no votes in it.
Out of the tree of life, I just picked me a plum.
Haughey's time in finance cemented his reputation as a talented minister, but in the public mind, Jack Lynch had quietly eclipsed him.
Still, it's a real good bet, the best is yet to come.
Lynch, as leader of Fianna Fáil, was the most popular leader that we've ever had. He was the person that all the Irish people couldn't really say a bad word against. He was a very, very nice individual.
Give me your autograph, please, will you? Well, no, I don't know what you want my autograph for.
It was very, very much the iron fist in the velvet glove. He had steel in him that you really had to get close up to know. But anyone who tangled with him and knew that that steel was there.
The best is yet to come and
That steel was to be tested just a few months after Lynch cruised to victory in the 1969 election. Events north of the border were about to spark the biggest crisis in Fianna Fáil's history.
Fellas came round with their clubs and their stones and they battered her. Man shot man and they started coming and saying, no, yeah, he's spinning base and all that.
I think we were forgotten people. I think the Dublin government was concentrating on its own natural and its own economic and social development.
After months of civil rights protests, the North ignited in August '69. The flashpoint was Derry.
In the Fianna Fáil party, and we more or less shout up Dev and up the Republic, but really we didn't have to do anything about it. And then we were confronted with the real stuff. Our people, as we returned them, were being attacked in Northern Ireland.
The violence spread quickly across the north. Within days, thousands were fleeing their homes after coming under attack from sectarian mobs.
It was the biggest mass movement of refugees in Western Europe since the end of the Second World War. Some 33,000 nationalists fled to seek refuge in the south of Ireland.
They were more or less being programmed out of existence. So therefore, what were people such as that supposed to do?
In Dublin, the government was coming under intense pressure to respond. On the 13th of August, Jack Lynch made an emergency broadcast to the nation.
It is clear now that the present situation cannot be allowed to continue. The Irish government can no longer stand by and see innocent people injured and perhaps worse.
In the following days, a stream of northern nationalists arrived in Dublin to hold Lynch to his word. Some felt it was clear what was being promised.
And no one, which included the Taoiseach at the time, the Minister for Defence, the Minister for Finance, who was Charlie Haughey, was in any doubt as to what the purpose of those meetings were. That arms were required within the 6 counties for nationalists to defend their areas.
That August, the Cabinet held one crisis meeting after another. Decisions made then were to have disastrous consequences for Charles Haughey and the entire government.
We had to take decisions quickly. You know, I'd like to stress that, you see, that the time was very narrow, short.
Haughey was given a place on a cabinet subcommittee that was to direct government policy on the north. As Minister for Finance, he was also given control of a relief fund worth £100,000.
If you decide that you are going to make a cabinet decision to provide money to relieve distress in Northern Ireland, how do you define relieving distress in Northern Ireland?
Well, I would like to stress that the government of which I was a member at no time agreed to or sanctioned or involved itself with the procurement of arms other than for the legitimate forces of the state.
I wouldn't believe that ever there was a formal cabinet decision to go off and say to buy arms, but it has always been my view, and it still remains my view, that in the government at the time, nobody said go off and do something, but you were expected to do something. And a committee was set up, and Charlie Haughey and others did what they thought was right.
Haughey was now at the centre of the government's reaction to the northern crisis, but his interest in the north had rarely been apparent until now.
He made no public statements on Northern Ireland in the 68 to 1970 period. Charlie Haughey, to my mind, was never a fundamentalist Republican in the way that Neil Blaney was.
We were conscious of the British flag and the British presence. The desire for a united Ireland would have been very, very strong.
Seemed out of character for somebody who's... It didn't seem to lie particularly with nationalism. It was concerned more about economic business matters to have got involved.
I think people like Blaney, Boland and Haughey thought that the growing crisis in Northern Ireland would lead to a situation in which what they thought was Lynch's weakness would be exposed and that one or other of them would succeed him.
In October 1969, an Army intelligence officer travelled to Ballyborough in County Cavan to meet several known Republicans. Those present believed that Captain James Kelly was offering official support for a plan to arm nationalists.
I understood that Charlie would have a role in financing such an operation. He never, in my recollection, got into the nitty-gritty, you know, of what was to be done and how it was to be done. This, it seems, had been left to Neil Blaney.
An inquiry later heard that money from the relief fund controlled by Haughey had been used in an attempt to purchase arms.
When it came to the inquiry into the £100,000, when Charlie's signature was on the chits authorising the payment of this money to Captain Kelly, I'm satisfied that Charlie knew what was going on.
The Ballyborough meeting triggered a series of shambolic attempts to buy weapons abroad. The guards received reports that Haughey's brother Jock was meeting arms dealers in London. Other shipments were sourced in New York and the continent, but each deal in turn fell apart.
There were times when I would come back and I would meet my colleagues and they would say, what in God's name has gone on, John? Are we being taken for a ride here? Or is this just a bit of kite flying? You know, what is happening? Why is it not becoming more concrete?
Finally, in April 1970, a cargo of arms was due to arrive in Dublin Airport from Vienna. Haughey ordered that the cargo be cleared through customs without inspection. But the entire plan was about to unravel.
I got an urgent call to cancel everything, to abort, because the special branch wanted it.
Haughey called Peter Berry, the Secretary of the Department of Justice. Berry's account of the conversation would later place Haughey at the centre of the planned operation.
You know about the cargo that's coming into Dublin Airport on Sunday?
Yes, Minister.
Can it be let through on a guarantee that it will go direct to the north? No. Well, what will happen to it when it arrives?
It will be grabbed.
I'd better have it called off.
Berry immediately told the Taoiseach of his conversation with Haughey. But Jack Lynch may already have had some knowledge of what was going on, from Jim Gibbons, the Minister for Defence.
Jim Gibbons told me that in the previous November, he went to Jack Lynch and had told him about this attempt to import guns. Lynch's response was, keep me informed, just let me know what's going on.
I think he had his hand forced by Berry. Berry more or less said, look, I'm telling you now, I am officially telling you. So Lynch, as Taoiseach, now officially knew. Whatever he suspected or knew before then, he now was known to know. Okay? So he had to do something.
But before Lynch could confront Haughey, events took an even stranger turn. On the morning he was due to deliver his budget, Charles Haughey ended up in hospital following a riding accident.
Sir Haughey did receive this injury to his head from a fall from a horse, and it has been suggested in certain newspapers that he sustained these injuries while being beaten up by some other people that were not consistent.
I was getting ready to go to school, and he was sitting in the sitting room in all his riding clothes, and he's looking quite bewildered and, you know, asking what day it was, and, oh, is today the budget day? Yes. Is it my budget? Yes. There was some blood trickling from his ear, and I didn't think anything of it at the time, but later they explained that he'd fractured his skull.
As Haughey recovered from his injuries, Lynch finally confronted him. But both Haughey and Neil Blaney denied any involvement and refused to resign. Lynch broke the news to his bewildered cabinet.
He told us of the alleged involvement of Neil Blaney and Charlie Haughey in the importation of arms. We were shocked. I can still feel as if I had been physically hit. The matter wasn't discussed any further.
Blaney, sitting at the cabinet table, barely acknowledged Lynch's revelations.
And Neil Blaney began dealing with a matter on the agenda about agriculture. I can still see him stressing a particular point by pressing his index finger on the table. And in a sense, it almost looked as if he was showing contempt to the Taoiseach.
Lynch thought it best to hush the whole thing up. Liam Cosgrave got hold of it. There doesn't seem to be any doubt he heard it from the special branch.
With the story about to break, Jack Lynch was finally forced to act.
I was coming down the stairs, and there in front of me were the papers on a table, and the headline was, Jack sacks Charlie Haughey, Neil Blaney, and Kevin Bourne resigns. I'm shocked on the stairs, because these were men that you lifted your hat to if you met them in the corridor. All of them were Taoiseachs, every one of them.
Can you give any further detail of the plot?
No, there are questions in the door next week. We've made a statement. I'm afraid I can't say any more.
By the morning of the 6th of May, 4 cabinet ministers were gone, and Fianna Fáil had been plunged into crisis. But Charles Haughey was facing more than just the loss of his job.
I do remember the day when the special branch came to take him away, and for the kids, obviously, it's hard.
They were looking, you know, we've come to arrest him, and my mother, she's there with the baby, she didn't know what to do, and anyway, they went in and they took him off.
What amazed me was they sent 2 or 3 of them around the back, I suppose, in case he was going to bolt out the back door. I don't know what they thought he was going to do.
It was strange, but that's what happened.
On the 28th of May 1970, Charles Haughey was charged with conspiracy to import arms. His remarkable journey from poverty in Donecarney to the highest reaches of government seemed at an end. But the most extraordinary part of Haughey's story was yet to come. In 1970, Charles Haughey was finished. Stripped of office and potentially facing jail, few could have foreseen what was yet to come.
His greatest achievement was being elected Taoiseach, without question. With all that went before him and all that happened, that in spite of that, he could still become Taoiseach.
Yet within a decade, Haughey would claw his way back to the very top. But the scars from that struggle would never heal.
I asked some people why they had voted for him. They didn't want to. They didn't like him. They didn't trust him. But they voted for him because they knew that if anyone else got it, he would destroy the party.
Haughey was a very destructive and corrosive and corrupting, in the best sense of the word, influence on the party.
Those guys did want the Clifton prizes. They did want to advance on those far pavilions. And they thought it was their fucking birthright. And we nailed them to the cross.
The defining moment for myself and others about Haughey would have been what happened in the 1970 arms trial.
This particular court case was embarrassing anyway, where 4 men have stood accused of conspiring to smuggle in arms and ammunition into the Irish Republic. The status of these men in the country has turned a normal court of
told the court that when the 4 were arrested, they replied, not guilty.
All the trouble was about a shipment of arms. Some claimed the government had authorized it, and others said they hadn't. And there's where the dispute came in.
It was a horrible time, I can tell you this, and a very, very difficult time for this country.
It was October 1970. Months earlier, Jack Lynch had confronted two senior ministers about their alleged involvement in a plot to smuggle weapons to Northern nationalists. Neil Blaney and Charles Haughey were charged with conspiracy to import arms. If found guilty, Haughey would end his political career behind bars.
He was passive, with very little emotion about it. He was confronted with a situation, he presented himself to court, and then the process went on. There was a sense that we had that he had been badly treated, yes.
It was a very, very highly charged time, and with a deep, deep sense of anger and resentment.
The arms trial combined high drama with low farce. The first trial collapsed when the judge walked out, claiming he'd been accused of bias. Neil Blaney saw his case dropped through lack of evidence. But Haughey was still in the dock, and the main evidence against him was a phone call to the senior civil servant, Peter Berry.
You know about the cargo that's coming into Dublin Airport on Sunday?
Yes, Minister.
Berry testified that in April 1970, as Special Branch prepared to seize an arms shipment due at the airport, Haughey had phoned him.
What will happen to it when it arrives?
It will be grabbed.
I'd better have it called off.
But on the witness stand, Haughey introduced a dramatic new twist to the phone conversation.
I'd better have it called off. Whatever it is.
Whatever it is. The crucial three words in his evidence on the basis of his defence were the three words, whatever it is. And of course that gave him the get-out clause, that I didn't know what it was. I got wind of this, I want it called off, whatever it is. I think Haughey in the witness box lied through his teeth.
Haughey had now broken ranks with his co-accused. Their defence was that their actions were sanctioned at the highest levels of government. By denying he knew what was being imported, Haughey had blown a hole in their case.
I perhaps felt wronged, and I know Jim Kelly did. And this applies to Blaney as well. Perhaps if they had stood up and said, you know, that this was government policy, and this is what we were about, and that is the end of the story. I think in hindsight, they both would have been enhanced by that straightforward acknowledgement. I think that Charlie, if anything else, is a survivor. Perhaps he thought that this was his way of answering what he felt was an attempt by former colleagues to shaft him.
He has actually never spoken about the arms trial. It's just funny, but he never has done.
And I would try and, you know, find a way in to the core of the matter, but you'd get a vague response. He just wasn't prepared to talk about it, full stop.
Wherever the truth lay, Haughey had mounted an effective defence. His performance in the dock impressed spectators at the trial.
I attended the arms trial every single day from the first day to the last day. I remember one incident where he was given evidence about phoning Peter Berry, and he said that he phoned him around 6 o'clock. And of course the barrister jumped up and says, how would you know whether it was 6 o'clock or any other time? For the very good reason, he says, that the Angelus bells were ringing in the background.
The state's case now hinged on Jim Gibbons, the former Minister for Defence. Gibbons was to testify that Haughey was central to the plot and that he was acting without cabinet authority.
Jack Lynch put Jim Gibbons in a position of where he felt he was responsible for the future of the party, that if he admitted that he had gone to Jack Lynch, and I told him about this when it was first reported to him in the previous November, that this would utterly destroy the Fianna Fáil party. He felt he had an obligation to just say he didn't recall.
Did you stand by the Taoiseach in the present crisis?
Absolutely, yeah. There's no shadow of doubt about that.
In court, however, Gibbons admitted that he had received information about plans to import weapons, but had not acted on it. This raised the possibility that the arms importation was legal. In his summing up, the judge gave the jury a choice: to believe either Peter Berry and Jim Gibbons, or to believe Charles Haughey.
Jury filed in one after another, so they all sat down, took their places, and the judge asked them if the foreman of the jury stood up. The judge asked them had they reached a verdict, and the foreman said yes. And what is your verdict? And he said, not guilty.
Charles Haughey and the other defendants walked free. The jury evidently believed that no crime had been committed. Now the spotlight swung to the man who had stood over the prosecution of his ministers.
You want Jack Lynch to resign? I couldn't care less what he does.
I think there is some dissatisfaction with his leadership at the moment. Those who are responsible for the debacle have no alternative now but to take the honourable course which is open to them.
I believe myself that at that point, Charlie Haughey believed that Jack's reign had come to an end.
But Haughey had miscalculated. Lynch, in New York when the verdicts were announced, arrived home to a show of support.
We had decided to get in touch with all the TDs and senators that we could and ask them to come to meet the Taoiseach at the airport. There was an effort made by the other side to get people not to go. But I saw the relief in Jack's face when he got off the plane.
There can be no compromise in fundamental policy.
The divisions all came from that. And this split stayed with the party right through until Bertie Ahern took over the leadership. But certainly it was a horrible party to be in.
It was a hard time for him, I think. You know, through the trial and all that, you're actually in the fight. But suddenly, I think probably when it was all over and there was the realisation, here he was, out of a job, young family. And I know he agonised long and hard about maybe, you know, leaving Fianna Fáil and setting up a new party. There was a lot of thinking. I mean, there was a lot of him walking around, deep in thought.
The only thing I said to him was, why would you be bothered about it all? If you're playing a match, he said, and the referee gives a decision against you, which you feel is an unfair one, you don't walk off the pitch. Maybe that's what the other team want you to do. But he said you stay on and that you win the match.
To take unpalatable action when I believed.
But to stay in the match, Haughey would have to swallow his pride. Just weeks after the trial, he had a decision to make. Support Jim Gibbons in a Dáil vote or face expulsion from the party.
I think he could have taken a different view, really. Instead of coming into Dáil Éireann and voting in a vote of confidence for Jim Gibbons. If he did that, and to me that was one of the lowest points. But if you had ambitions to be prominent in politics, that it was the thing to do, to stay in there and fight from there.
Not everyone had Haughey's survival instincts. At the 71 Ardèche, Lynch's enemies made one last stand. Open opposition to the leader was crushed. Boland and Blaney would quit the party, but Charles Haughey wasn't going to follow them. He would stay and fight from within.
Just before the leader's speech, Dad walked up onto the stage. The front bench were unaware that he had slipped up onto the back. But the delegates saw him. There was a huge cheer, chants of, you know, Charlie and all this. Jack Lynch had to get up and go over and shake his hand. And that was a momentous occasion because that was the first time that he'd had to shake his hand or that they had had any communication since he'd been sacked. Knowing my father, most things he's worked out beforehand, so I'm quite sure he was choosing his moment all right.
All the time that he was out in the cold, he went to every function that he could possibly go to throughout the country. And the names of people who indicated to him that they were on his side. Charlie built up an organisation for himself all through the whole country.
I had the gig of driving. He's a hopeless driver, by the way. Just as well he has somebody driving because he can't drive for nuts. Dangerous, lethal. We went to a dinner one night in the Midlands. The standard offering was nearly always chicken and ham. And everyone had food put in front of them except the host. Charlie said to him, are you not eating? And just as the man replied, this huge T-bone steak was put in front of him. It was hanging over the edge of the plate. And he said, well, to be perfectly honest, Charlie, he said, I hate that pig meat. Mr. Haughey was not very impressed about that, and on the way home he certainly got 10 minutes of our attention in the car. There was never a kind of a master plan. A lot was unspoken, what was going on. But I suspect I knew, and I suspect he bloody well knew too what was going on. Yeah.
What motivated him was the restoration of his own position and his own dignity. He felt that he had been slighted in the arms trial, and therefore he was remaking himself as one part of what drove him and what motivated him.
Haughey's wealthy business friends were playing their own part in his climb back to power.
The cars would be made available and a few tires and make sure that the petrol was in the car while he was making his movements around the country and going for the chicken dinners. And chicken dinners, no wonder he loves the cockhardy. After all those chicken dinners, wouldn't anybody?
Haughey's friend Des Traynor was now on the board of Cement Roadstone Holdings. In 1973, Haughey sold a parcel of land at Kinseely to CRH for £140,000, more than he had paid for the entire estate just 4 years before. CRH has denied that Traynor had any involvement in the transaction.
He bought the house in 1969. He sold a good chunk of land to the people who had the quarry at Feltram, which nearly paid for the whole house. So the house, as far as I was concerned, really didn't cost him very much.
They're all very nice louvers. These are lovely louvers.
Traynor tried and failed to get Haughey appointed chairman of CRH, but the reality was that out of office, Haughey's influence was drying up. He fell back on his bank overdraft to pay for a lifestyle that was costing him £12,000 a month.
There was a particular meeting in 1976 at which stage the debt had topped 300,000, at which the AIB officials said that Haughey became quite vicious in his approach to them, and he was very angry at the idea that they would take back his checkbook. He told them there was no way that they could take his checkbook because he needed to live. He seemed to believe that the banks were there just to give him money to fund whatever lifestyle he wanted to lead.
To me, he didn't live an extravagant social life. He didn't entertain lavishly in his home or anything like that. There was no evidence of any, if you like, egregious expenditure like that, other than the house, the big house on the island or whatever else, no more than that.
Exiled from power, Haughey kept adding to his possessions. In 1973, as his overdraft approached £500,000, he bought himself an island, Inishvikalon, off the coast of Kerry.
The attraction, I think, of island life to someone like Haughey, it's a notion of absolute solitude, of sanctuary and withdrawal. And I think Haughey himself kind of walled himself in. And one way of doing it was Abbeville, maybe, but another is to buy an island where they can't get at you.
Well, certainly as a family, I do recall discussing money from time to time. I think all of us thought that it was as a result of very shrewd investments in property and shares. I don't think he ever really worried about money. Now, that's been honest with you. I think his whole life was politics and achievements and his vision and so forth. And I don't think money cost him a thought.
I think he needed power as much as he needed wealth, and that both of those needs arose from a kind of deep insecurity within. That he was a melancholy man, and that he needed to cheer himself up with the feeling that significance could be found.
Haughey used his years in the political wilderness to shed his brash 60s image. By the mid-70s, he had successfully rebranded himself as a family values conservative, the darling of Middle Ireland.
All kinds of contraceptive devices are freely available throughout our community without medical supervision of any sort. That gives rise to an intolerable situation.
The party was moving away from its roots in rural Ireland. Here was a man who bothered to come down and sit down with us and have the chicken and chips, and we knew we had someone in Dublin that was listening to us.
It was easy to follow Charlie Haughey in those years. Charlie Haughey was a good Republican, and that he expressed Republican principles. He represented what Fianna Fáil stood for, full stop.
Everybody also accepts that taxes must be paid.
Even in his contradictions, especially in his contradictions maybe, Haughey did represent a self-deceiving quality in many of us, and maybe that's partly why people identified for so long with him and why they're still fascinated by him as an icon. He was like a mirror. He just reflected back to people whatever they wished to see at a given moment.
With Fianna Fáil languishing in opposition, the clamour to bring back Haughey had become deafening.
Honorary Secretaries, Brian Lenihan and Charlie Haughey.
Is this the beginning of Charles Haughey's climb back to the top of Fianna Fáil?
No, I don't look on it in that light at all.
You're the man who sacked him. He's now on his way back.
I sacked him under certain circumstances, and I think he accepted what I did, possibly not with very good grace. But now he is back working hard with us, and well, he's welcome to make his contribution.
There was a meeting where Jack Lynch announced that he was bringing back Charlie Haughey onto the front bench, the opposition spokesman. And in fairness, I must say, Haughey was a very able politician. I was very taken aback. I had always had the view that he was a very divisive, destructive influence in the party. I've never changed that opinion. And of course, the other thing is, I have to say, I never trusted him. So, as simple as that.
It was a great surprise and shock when he was brought back, and I'm never clear as to why it happened. I didn't think Jack Lynch would do that. And of course, immediately it made him very vulnerable. Raised the question of the succession, how he was a likely successor. So that was a crucial moment, I think.
Lynch soon had cause to regret his decision. Almost as soon as he had returned to the front bench, rumours began of a Haughey threat to Lynch's leadership.
Charlie seemed to literally want the job and go after it. At that time, it looked horrendous. It looked cheeky and it looked wrong.
Charlie wouldn't have been content with anything on his vintage.
There is no leadership crisis in Fianna Fáil. We are not casting around for a leader. We have a leader, democratically chosen, and as such...
But Haughey bided his time, placing his leadership ambitions on hold until the party had cleared the next electoral hurdle. In May 1977, the Fine Gael-led coalition called a snap election. Fianna Fáil unveiled a giveaway manifesto in an all-out bid to return to power.
No more rates, nearly all car tax scrapped, more income tax relief, more jobs are all part of a multi-million-pound package.
What will you say to the charge that you're simply trying to buy office by doing this?
I would reject that, of course, naturally and completely. I would say that our programme is directly related to the social and economic needs of the current situation.
Charlie Haughey had nothing to do with the 77 Fianna Fáil manifesto. Like, he thought it was an abomination and thought it was a ridiculous bit of garbage.
Our day will come.
We have Fianna Fáil at 68. Des O'Malley in Limerick has returned. Fine Gael at 33.
The voters didn't share Haughey's private doubts. The manifesto propelled Fianna Fáil to an historic victory.
The largest majority that any Irish government's had for a very, very long time.
But for Jack Lynch, this victory came at a price.
And I was covering counts in the RDS, and Charles Haughey was sitting in front of the television and I was standing behind, and Pádraig Flynn popped up on the screen, right, put his hands up with victory, and Mr. Haughey was absolutely thrilled. And I said to him, what are you so happy about? I said, Jack Lynch has won and won and won. And he said, he's one of my guys. He said, now I know I'll be Taoiseach, he said.
We got a list on the Fianna Fáil Parliamentary Party, and there were 84 deputies, many of them new. So when we went through the list, I think we found 12 or 13 that we said, if Mr. Lynch were to be run over by the number 10 bus or were to retire tomorrow morning or whatever, how many votes would Charlie Haughey get? And it was about 12 or 13. And that was probably, what, June 1977.
Back in Cabinet as Minister for Health and Social Welfare, Haughey was perfectly placed to win over each new TD.
He said, I want you to ensure that these deputies are provided with a first-class service from my office. And as you know, health and social welfare are huge issues for each deputy. And Haughey himself said one of his aims was to humanise the whole health and social welfare system, to make it more accessible and to ensure that people got their just entitlements.
This is a Charlie Haughey press conference. Take a closer look and there's no one smoking. And they're all Irish, but not one of them's on the hard stuff.
I greatly appreciate your rallying around.
Always expert at generating publicity, Haughey was now grabbing headlines for all the right reasons.
He was the first person that started the restrictions on advertising tobacco. You see, in those years, people used to smoke giving television interviews, for goodness sake. And he felt that, seeing that we had embarked upon this, that a good example should be set, and those who smoked should not smoke on the platform.
I think that is a great headline for us, and I'm very grateful to all my colleagues. And particular, I think, whatever else we may be grateful for, to the Taoiseach. And you and I know how devoted that man is to that pipe of his.
I thought that was a bit of a gimmick at that time. It didn't really matter. You could go behind the stage and have a cigarette if you wanted to.
I think a lot of people probably weren't too happy about it, but, you know, it turned out he was somewhat ahead of his time in that matter.
As Haughey's reputation rose, the governments declined. In 1979, things began to go drastically wrong for Jack Lynch.
Oh, it was all right for the first year or two. Everybody knew that it was impregnable. Then second oil shock, all bets off. We had to start tightening things up. Result, postal strikes, telephone strikes. So naturally then the pressure's on from the Haughey camp.
There were a lot of people like myself and others who just thought Jack Lynch, his time had come and gone, And I believe that Haughey was the man to do something about it. And we're getting further into the mire.
With the Taoiseach's authority in decline, two ministers began to jostle for position.
What all of us younger politicians inherited was a 20 or 30 year battle between George Colley and Charles Haughey.
I remember Sean Doherty saying, we got dragged into old men's wars.
They went to school together, they grew up together. I suppose people used to say they were in competition together.
George Colley was a very straightforward and upright and honest man in every way, but he did belong to the older version of Fianna Fáil, who felt that they could rule the party with the iron hand, and that wasn't acceptable to the new deputies.
On a trip to Washington in late '79, Jack Lynch's leadership finally unravelled. While he was away, Fianna Fáil suffered two humiliating by-election defeats in Cork, Lynch's backyard. Haughey made his move.
On Taoiseach, welcome to you.
We got a message to say that Charlie Haughey had made a speech in which he had extolled blood sacrifice. This drove Jack Lynch bananas. I phoned Charlie Haughey from the United States. He said he had no intention of withdrawing anything. Charlie said something to the effect, you know, F and Frank, he's finished.
This Tuesday, forensic police were...
Just 2 years after winning a landslide victory, Jack Lynch was being forced from office by a backbench revolt. But before he stood down, Lynch had one final aim: to stop Haughey.
As I announced at the Fianna Fáil party meeting this morning, I have decided to resign as Taoiseach.
Jack Lynch stood down, I think, early in order to facilitate George Colley. George Colley had informed Jack Lynch that he had the votes and that all would be well.
Haughey had spent decades preparing for this moment. He was the outsider who had clawed his way to the top of politics, the survivor who had fought his way back from ruin. Now, a lifetime's work would turn on a 2-day battle with his arch-rival, George Colley.
Fianna Fáil changed at that leadership contest and never went back. There was an air of menace around, and there was an air of danger.
Mr. Haughey had a group of supporters, strong supporters, no doubt about that. People who were utterly, absolutely devoted.
Anybody at the parliamentary party at that time was under enormous pressure. Some people said it was intimidation.
If there was any intimidation at all and coercion, it was from the other side, because they had the power to so do. They had all the cards, they had all the aces, they had all the prospective aces, and they used them naturally. But Haughey didn't, because he couldn't. He nothing to give.
On the eve of the election, both sides were confident of victory. But who really had the votes?
Charlie Haughey, I'd say, he's the worst judge of people in politics. Haughey was going through the list and one to the other people and oh, he'll vote me, one to the other. And myself and Doherty, many people knew these people weren't going to vote for him at all. And Doherty, for fuck's sake, he said, you're not going to get anything like a vote like that. You're the worst effing judge of people I have ever met.
I remember asking George Colley, I presume you've canvassed the deputies and you have the votes. And he looked at me and the impression he gave me was that, look, if you want to lead the country and you want to lead Fianna Fáil, you don't canvass backbenchers. You know, this mantle falls on you.
They say, how are you guys doing? They were saying, oh, no, don't worry, we're fine. And I say, no, guys, you're not fine. I said, we have you by the ass. If I want to tell you, it's over for you guys. And they didn't believe it. They thought, even 10 o'clock on the night before, that they were going to prevail.
On the morning of the 7th of December 1979, the party gathered to decide its future.
Charlie Haughey couldn't get anybody in the Fianna Fáil cabinet to propose it.
I spoke to George Colley before he went into the parliamentary party, and he was quite convinced he had it won.
It will be all right, he said. They will support me because it's the tradition of the party. It's the natural progression.
Haughey's bid seemed hopeless. His cabinet colleagues were united against him. But at the 11th hour, Foreign Affairs Minister Michael O'Kennedy switched sides.
I didn't like it. I felt it was the start of George being beaten that day.
We didn't realise the degree of support that Haughey had garnered.
The result was Charles Haughey 44, George Haughey 38.
He won it. And I have to tell you, it was wonderful.
And I am greatly honoured.
I was devastated, actually. I just couldn't believe it. I just couldn't believe it.
I couldn't believe it. I said, my God, I better get out of here. I need to collect my thoughts. Olivia O'Leary shouted after me, but Minister, surely you must be able to say something. And I turned around and thought, yes, it's the first Friday and I'm going to Mass. It was the only thing sensible I could think of.
First of all, I've been promised in the most sincere way by George Colley his total and fullest cooperation in my new task.
And George said, I never said anything of the sort to you. And he said, you'll get the same support from me that you gave Jack Lynch. In other words, there'll be no peace.
Charles Haughey had seized power in a backbench revolution. But the party's tradition of loyalty to the leader had been broken, and Haughey, as leader, would pay the price. Four days after his election as leader of Fianna Fáil, Charles Haughey prepared to be confirmed in the Dáil as Taoiseach.
I went and I picked up my mother and we went into Dáil.
I know that my grandmother was so proud going into the Dáil with her hat and she was wearing all her medals, you know.
She brought up this family in difficult circumstances, widowed at a relatively young age. One of her sons becomes Taoiseach, and now the reality, I suppose, of Irish political life was a rude awakening for her.
I couldn't believe that they'd all troop in and vote for him. Do you know who persuaded me? And it was Jim Gibbons. Gibbons came to me and said, look, he says, if I can vote for Charlie Haughey as Taoiseach, you can.
Before the vote, members of the Dáil would have a chance to debate Haughey's suitability for the office.
I prepared a tough speech saying that I thought he was an inappropriate person to become Prime Minister. And I said at the very beginning of my speech that all previous leaders of the state had had the full support and loyalty of their own parties. And here for the first time was someone who was regarded as totally unsuitable for the job by over 1/3 of his party. And in this respect, I felt he had a flawed pedigree.
My mother was in the public gallery, and I think she was shocked and upset. I thought it was a very unfortunate choice of words. I mean, the word pedigree.
Flawed pedigree, I mean, that metaphor reeks of social snobbery. Who talks about pedigrees, you know?
The phrase was intended to apply to his political pedigree, and in that sense, the phrase was accurate.
There was, of course, a subliminal thing for old-time Fianna Fáilers. Haughey's father was more associated with the Free State than with the Republic.
For 6 hours, Haughey listened as his opponents lined up to attack him.
My fear, Mr. Haughey, is his obsession with being the leader, with being the top man, with being the Taoiseach. I think to do that, to achieve that, he has done, I believe, some things which to me are unforgivable.
The fact that he was corrupting the tax system, that he was corrupting a lot of other people in the process, well, I mean, that was a necessary part of the price that had to be paid so that the nation could enjoy his undoubted unique talents.
You can see how Haughey's sense of being an outsider would be hugely conditioned by these moments when there's an almost moralistic language used about him.
It was obvious that it affected him deeply and that he felt very resentful about it. It was very clear to me.
He had won, hadn't he? He had, you know, the glittering prize within his grasp. And if he had to wait 6 hours longer before he went to the Oris to get his seat of office, so be it.
The day that Charles Haughey became Taoiseach, he was collecting money.
There was a little bit of panic stations, tidy up his financial affairs and get everything sorted out all over 48 hours. You know, that's basically it.
Haughey urgently needed to square his debt with AIB, which by now had climbed to over £1 million. The new Taoiseach summoned Pat Gallagher to Abbeyville.
He asked me for private support as a friend because I knew him from 4 years of age. So at 29, I was very harsh in my words. And I just said, tell me the fucking truth. How much do you fucking owe? And he told me the truth. And we were able to solve the problem.
Gallagher agreed to pay off a third of Haughey's £1 million debt. On paper, it was presented as a property deal, but no land changed hands.
By God, and I categorically have to say it, you would not get one favour back. It's just to keep the show on the road. Keep the show on the road.
The bank that had aggressively pursued Haughey for a decade now dramatically changed its tune. AIB sent Haughey a letter of congratulations and wrote off nearly £400,000 of his debt. More than £300,000 poured into an account opened by Des Traynor to settle the rest. Where this money came from is unknown.
The sources of your obvious wealth have never been disclosed. Would you consider disclosing your business?
I think there's a very simple false assumption which you're saying that I am a wealthy man. I wouldn't necessarily assume that if I were you. Ask my bank manager.
For nearly a decade, Haughey had focused his energies on a single goal, the pursuit of power. Now that he held the top job, what was he going to do with it?
At the time, I would have thought that he was the potentially most able leader Fianna Fáil had.
Hello, Kevin. How are you? Haughey was the man that we thought was the person to straighten out the economy and the public finances.
He was connected with that earlier period of prosperity in the 60s. And as people sank maybe into recession, they thought that he would bring them out of it.
Haughey made a promising start to his first period as Taoiseach.
We had to borrow in 1979 over £1,000 million. We'll have to cut down on government spending. The government will have to be curtailed or postponed until such time would be a major disaster. I believe that everyone listening to me tonight will cause suffering and hardship.
If you want a prescription for what should have been done, I think you would find it in the speech that was made by Charlie Haughey in January 1980.
It's madness to think that we can keep on looking for more money for less work.
But the country was heading for national bankruptcy.
It's madness. The burden of oil prices will continue.
We would have been run by the IMF, not by our own government, if that had continued.
As a community,
we have been living beyond our means. It is the duty of your government to restore that situation And that is what we are going to do.
What happened afterwards was a direct contradiction of what he had said in the speech, which always puzzled me.
Makes a speech about belt tightening and all the rest of it. What does he do? Turns around and starts borrowing and spending money like water.
I went over to the Minister for Finance's office. The Minister for Finance was present in the room, but the Taoiseach was at the table in the office, large office, with various finance officials around him. And he was conducting the interviews and discussions with the ministers. And that seemed to me extraordinary.
Despite his pledges, public spending soared under Haughey, and the country fell further into debt.
Has announced approval in principle for the development of an airport in County Mayo.
We have a situation in regard to the Talbot work.
It's justifiable expenditure, in my view.
The economy of a banana republic without the bananas.
On his initial promise of financial rectitude.
Frankly stated, the first period of government, he didn't really get a handle on the economy.
Employment increased by 46%.
That was the start of my disillusionment. And he was very, very indecisive. He proved himself exceptionally indecisive in that period in government.
You must remember that he had planned for 10 years in the wilderness to get power and climbed his way back up to become leader of Fianna Fáil and Taoiseach. But he hadn't put sufficient thought, in my view, into what would he do when he got it.
When boyhood's fire was in my blood.
As the economy stalled, Haughey was determined to make his mark elsewhere.
We must face the reality that Northern Ireland as a political entity has failed and that a new beginning is needed.
But in playing the green card, Haughey was taking a huge political gamble.
The president of a man who was up on gun running charges. The president of a man who has resigned.
Said at his news conference, his political attitude is tinged with the green of republicanism.
He has the blood of Ulster men on his coat. Charles Haughey, who was responsible for bringing arms...
For Haughey to make a breakthrough on the north, he'd need to build a relationship with his British counterpart, Margaret Thatcher. In May 1980, the two leaders met in London for the first time.
There was a chemistry between them. She is a very good-looking woman. She's very sharp, very intelligent, and he also has his own attractions, I suppose. And they got on quite well. The outcome of the meeting was, look, we'll go and look into what can be done, and we'll have a meeting. And he said, yes, okay, fine. Dublin, fine. She said, I'd love to come to Dublin. I've never been there.
On the 8th of December 1980, Margaret Thatcher arrived at Dublin Castle. It was the first visit by a British Premier since independence.
She brought the most extraordinary delegation. It was the most powerful delegation from the British that we have seen. And that is the meeting which established the ideas of joint studies. It set up a council, an Anglo-Irish Intergovernmental Council.
And from there on, the analysis became different. And then you went on into a different and more equal relationship between two sovereign governments.
But in the short term, Haughey would throw away the progress made by overselling the talks with Thatcher.
It would be our wish and our intention that no possibility would be ruled out.
Mr. Haughey sent Brian Lenihan out as Minister for Foreign Affairs and talked about Irish unity within 10 years. And that drove Mrs. Thatcher around the bend.
But you're not moving into the constitutional realm. You're not...
Good heavens, no, nothing like that.
She was livid. She had a meeting with the Taoiseach, and she said, I never mentioned Irish unity. I never said Irish unity with 10 years. I don't know where this story has come from. This is a complete travesty of what we talked about. The effect of that was to destroy the sort of feeling of trust between the two of them. And that was a tragedy as far as Northern Ireland was concerned.
With Anglo-Irish relations at a new low and the economy in tatters, Haughey's second year in power was beset by tragedy.
In view of the
of the loss of life in the tragic fire in the Stardust Club Artane last night, the Ordesh should be cancelled.
Now in June 1981, Haughey faced his first election as Taoiseach. He had everything to lose. A resurgent Fine Gael posed a real threat to the majority he'd inherited from Jack Lynch.
We would like to ask Mr. Haughey what he did about the H-Block hunger strikers, what he did for Bobby Sands.
And once more Northern Ireland threatened his ambitions. The hunger strikes loomed large over the entire election.
The fact that these people died, that really inflamed the whole Republican constituency. You know, they weren't in a mood for making peace after that.
The possibility of violence was worrying party workers.
I was on the campaign trail with him. It was scary at times. You know, we came into towns and villages, and you know, there'd be people in black berets and marching. There'd be silent protests, and then it was quite eerie at times. Actually, it was quite scary.
We would like to ask Mr. Haughey what he did for Francis Hughes.
Will not be deflected or intimidated by anybody from going out and meeting the Irish people.
The hunger strikers took 2 seats, and Haughey failed to keep his majority in the Dáil. After just 18 months, he was out.
In a sense, he will regard his biggest achievement as becoming Taoiseach in late 1979, and in a sense it is his biggest achievement. What he did with the power is open to great question.
It was over. Haughey had split the party in his struggle to reach the top, but had stumbled badly once in office. Over the next 2 years, Charles Haughey would face his enemies in a bitter struggle for control of Fianna Fáil.
This enemy, this total demonic figure, won in 79, and the people on the other side couldn't take it. They couldn't give to him the leadership, and they couldn't give to him the loyalty that he and others had to swallow for the previous 9 years.
I was reluctant to be the challenger. I felt ultimately that I had no option but to do it.
All of the heaves against Charlie Haughey therefore were based on an attempt to restore an order that's gone, shattered, never to return.
The person who had gone up for that office before was the one who should.
I found myself with a few lonely moments, sitting there saying, well, hang on now, you know, who's going to slay the dragon?
They persuaded me, and I think Haughey agreed that probably I had a better chance.
The leadership challenge was now out in the open. Haughey began to pressure Gregory to agree a deal.
Haughey came back with a beautifully embossed document, and I saw that it was all just general commitments, and I just handed it back to him, and I said that's no use to us. And he was quite taken aback, and he said, what you mean? And I said, we gave you a list of specifics.
As Haughey stumbled, Des O'Malley's challenge was also about to take a knock.
Bruce Arnold had been writing that Des O'Malley was going to win, and he had foretold that, predicted that he would get 47 votes in the parliamentary party, and named them in the paper. Well, now, you don't name people like that in the paper to somebody like me and to friends of mine. Really, those 47? suddenly we had a little call to those of that 47 that needed to be called, and they were going to vote for Charlie Haughey.
Well, that finished it entirely. But should that give Charlie Haughey the list? They're the list of people that should contact him. They must be dithering. So you just put the pressure on them.
At the next party meeting, O'Malley's supporters were expected to push the leadership issue to a vote, but backed down at the 11th hour.
I was very disappointed that some people didn't see it through as I would have expected they would, and as they told me they would.
We all made a disgrace of ourselves, and I'm chickening out. And I made up my mind, by Jesus, I said, next time I'll do it myself, because I know the only one I'll trust will be myself.
Haughey had won without a fight, and the abortive heave had merely exposed division in the opposition camp.
Say I'm here. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Haughey, if you have any questions for him, I'm sure he'd be delighted to answer them.
Within reason. You are a totally united party, having arrived at a unanimous decision without any dissent whatsoever.
Mr. Haughey, is there any significance in the fact that Mr. O'Malley is not present?
None at all. None at all. No, the people are here, just a few colleagues that happen to be around. None whatsoever.
Now just one hurdle remained in Haughey's path to the Taoiseach's office.
Whatever specifics Haughey was delivering, we wanted them signed and sealed in a written contract. So Haughey signed up and I signed, and as he was leaving, he grinned and he said, well, lads, as Al Capone used to say, it's nice doing business with us.
The next day, with the support of Tony Gregory and the Workers' Party, Charles Haughey became Taoiseach for the second time. Nervous TDs waited for the call to join his government.
In the few hours before the government was formed, Charles Haughey asked me to drop over to his office. On the way, I was getting handshakes from people, but it turned out he wanted to discuss something else. So I don't know if he did that deliberately or not. I don't think I'll ever know, but I know that the timing of it was such that my hopes were up a bit.
He had good men, but he had some right latchicos too, who felt that they were the Taoiseach, and the arrogance of some of them was unbelievable. Frank Hall had a great line about Charlie Haughey one time. I always liked it. He said he would trust Charlie, but he wouldn't trust the fellas that Charlie trusts. I'd have the same view.
He was far too indulgent of lesser quality people. There were people that he had in his government and persisted with over a long period of time, who in my view probably shouldn't have been left there.
Haughey had sidelined his enemies. Now he moved to take control of party funds.
He wanted to have his own man. I didn't suit, and he wanted to get rid of me, and I saw things differently, and I refused to go. He wanted to know who was subscribing. I said to him, look, I'll go once an audit is done, but I refuse to go until an audit is done. The members of the committee got an invitation to a meeting in Kinseely, and at the meeting, Mr. Haughey brought influence to bear on members of the committee to sign a document instructing me to hand over the books. But I didn't hand over those books until the audit was done, and not a minute sooner.
Taking control of the economy was a much tougher proposition. Haughey was committed to reining in public spending, but the Gregory deal alone would cost £80 million in 1982.
The first priority is getting the public finances in order. This is precisely one of the areas where you've been most criticised and most under attack, that it's what you haven't done.
Don't be spreading more of this gloom and doom and despair.
Why don't you do right?
Today, the budget deficit is at a record level.
Inflation and unemployment among the highest in Europe. Mr. Haughey's instinct is to counter
absolute rigid control of
at 10%. That means cutting foreign debts equal £1,200 for every man, woman and child in the country.
Things were very difficult in 1982. The economy was in rag order. There was a disunity and there was a lack of morale generally in the party. God, we got terrible press.
I was writing strongly critical articles about Haughey's lack of leadership at a time of crisis, really, for the country.
RTE are out to get me. The independent newspapers don't love me. You know, the Irish Times is, you know, full of liberal pinkos. You know, what's going on down there? Who's running that place? Who wrote that leading article? You know, how do I know who wrote it? Don't give me any smart answers. You just go on and get on the case. Tell them, fuck all, I said. No. Don't tell them anything. I said, can't do that. Well, you can do that. That's all I'm telling you this evening. Now, go off. Don't be annoying me. I have more important things to do. And he played these games with you, these kind of mind games.
I would often get blamed for things and get sermonized for things that I had nothing to do with because, as he put it himself once, you know, O'Donnell, you're the nearest backside that can be kicked, so you're getting kicked.
He has a volcanic nuclear temper. Sometimes he could just take so much and he would explode. One of Mr. Haughey's really trusted advisors said to me, Catherine, if you don't tell him at least to foxtrot Oscar, on one occasion he said, you're lost. You'll have lost it. You won't be able to deal with him. So I was called in to be grilled. I said, well, if you weren't Taoiseach, I'd tell you to foxtrot Oscar. But you are Taoiseach, so I won't. And Mr. Haughey smiled at me, said, I think we understand each other perfectly.
I remember being in the old Dáil restaurant with several Fianna Fáil TDs at the time, and Haughey coming in and sitting down at the table, and the other people at that table were I don't know how to describe it, but were quivering with, I presume, fear.
Grown men would be terrified of him. Would talk to you in corridors or behind bushes or go over to Merrion Square or talk to you on the telephone because they wouldn't be seen talking to you in the house. And I found it absolutely extraordinary that he could terrify people like that. There was a very substantial minority of people in Fianna Fáil who did not wish to see him as leader. Therefore, you constantly had leaks, sources coming forward so that this stuff could go into the media.
Convinced that confidential information was being leaked from the Cabinet, Haughey and Justice Minister Sean Doherty set about finding who was responsible. Haughey summoned the head of Garda Intelligence to a meeting.
He told me quite clearly that he was worried about leaks appearing in the paper, which, according to himself, and it was common knowledge at the time, that they were coming from the Cabinet table. That was as simple. He asked me, could I do anything about it to find out what was going on? Sean Doherty then came to me when he arrived in my office. He said, were there ever journalist taps before? And I said, yes, there were. Well, he says, the Independent is carrying an awful lot of stuff. Yes, says I to him. And Bruce Arnold, says I, is the driving force there. He says, could we put a tap on him? Says I, a tap could be put on him. And says I, it can only be put on for a short time.
Within weeks, tapes of Bruce Arnold's phone conversations were being recorded at the GPO in Dublin. Shortly afterwards, Doherty gave the go-ahead for a tap on Geraldine Kennedy's phone.
The only lawful basis for tapping people in the state at that time was that you were involved in crime, right, or in subversive activity. The grounds put forward were completely illegitimate and subsequently proved to be unlawful.
That I could be seen as some kind of subversive or spy on behalf of the British. It was so absurd and so insulting to my integrity as a journalist as to be incredible.
Despite Haughey's later denials, Joe Ainsworth believes that knowledge of the tapping went all the way to the top.
I was with the Commissioner in Mr. Haughey's office, and he broached the question of the leaks again. And I said to him quite clearly, I was doing what I could, but I didn't tell him that there was a phone tap put on Bruce Arnold's phone. But I'm sure he would have thought in his mind that One of the methods that I would adopt was to carry out phone tapping.
Morning, beautiful children.
Haughey seemed to enjoy the air of mystery that surrounded his life. He was apparently able to maintain a mansion, a stud farm, and an island, all on a Taoiseach salary.
When we were in McGill, there were all these lists of stories going around all the time. The first one was always Charles Haughey's money. Where did it come from? And it was like a running joke. But they had a sense that, there was an element of the loaves and fishes about Charles Haughey's wealth, but somehow it didn't compute.
The secrets of Haughey's wealth were well hidden. His old friend Des Traynor had set up an elaborate system of offshore accounts for Haughey and other wealthy clients.
Now it was a small select group who had access to Traynor, who effectively took money which may have been declared to the taxman but usually hadn't been declared to the taxman, placed it in bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, except it wasn't placed in the Cayman Islands. It was still available to them in Dublin, hidden from the authorities. Massive sums of money.
If you have the Taoiseach of a country having his own personal advisor, running a secret bank account and allowing a number of privileged people to participate in this scam for avoiding their tax, of course it's corruption.
Haughey would later deny he knew anything of Traynor's activities on his behalf. Yet the two men were in constant contact.
Well, I would usually be at Abbeyville at the weekend, and I would see Des Traynor on a Saturday or Sunday morning. And occasionally, during the weekdays, well, very occasionally, in government buildings. And I came to the conclusion that Mr. Haughey had benefactors from the time he became Taoiseach, right up until the time he retired, because he had just his Taoiseach salary.
The search for explanations of Haughey's lifestyle led journalists to look at John Byrne, a wealthy property developer. In the early 80s, Byrne was seeking planning permission for 2,000 houses at Baldoyle, a few miles from Kinseely.
One way of dealing with Haughey's problems would be if you could bust up the Greenbelt. Baldoyle Racecourse had been closed. Supposing you could get water and sewerage through that, you could build a lot of houses. Then you could run the sewer back up towards Kinseely, and you'd have another few hundred acres of nice green development land. So that was one of the things I was also trying to probe at that very stage.
But all observers could point to was Haughey's friendship with Byrne and the presence of Des Traynor on the board of his property company. Byrne dismissed claims of Haughey's involvement in his Baldoyle development.
Absolute rubbish. Mr. Haughey has no interest whatsoever, directly or indirectly.
John Byrne has always denied being a financial supporter of Charles Haughey. Although a cheque from him for £50,000 was later shown to have been lodged into one of Haughey's accounts, Byrne maintained he had no idea how this had happened. In any case, the development at Baldoyle was refused planning permission. The key to Haughey's lifestyle evidently lay elsewhere.
The frustration for me during all that period was, in one sense, I knew a lot, and in another sense, I knew nothing.
In Charles Haughey's government, anything seemed possible. All the rumours about his wealth were nothing compared to the storm of scandals that were about to break.
Everybody suspected the weirdest things at the time.
Things were happening every single month. These were exciting times. They were pretty vicious at times as well.
Haughey's election agent, Pat O'Connor, was charged with voting twice in February, but was acquitted on appeal.
We always heard that Fianna Fáil were always good at election time for voting early and vote often.
The world has gone mad today and good's bad.
Haughey's Justice Minister, Sean Doherty, was also under constant fire in the Department of Justice.
Today, that woman prized today.
Stories began to emerge about him threatening to transfer guards in Roscommon. The rumour mill ran at full tide with Mr. Haughey, and often you'd say that couldn't possibly be true.
That anything goes.
As I would mount the steps of government buildings, I would say in my mind, oh God, I wonder what horrors are about to unleash themselves today, you know.
Mr. Connolly's association with a man who's been charged with 2 murders.
In August, Ireland's most wanted man was found living in the Attorney General's apartment.
The AG, member of your government, and a murderer in his apartment. I mean, what worse can you get?
The world has gone mad.
The Attorney General was in no way implicated in the murders, and the Taoiseach let him fly to the States on holiday as the crisis broke. But in the ensuing uproar, Connolly was forced to return.
Will you talk to us tomorrow morning, please?
Now, Mr. Haughey was not involved with the murder.
MacArthur had ran the gauntlet of a hostile crowd.
I think at that stage Mr. Haughey had entirely lost his judgment, but I think actually he was very, very, very shocked, as was the whole country at the time.
A grotesque situation.
Literally unbelievable.
Bizarre. Unprecedented.
As the government lurched from one scandal to another, one deputy decided he'd finally had enough of Charles Haughey's leadership.
Came out of the blue. McCreevy just walked into Leinster House and just puts down a motion of no confidence in Charlie Haughey as leader of the Fianna Fáil party.
When Charlie McCreevy moved in October '82, that was within about 2 weeks of the publication of The Way Forward.
This plan is endorsed by the central bank.
It was just the point at which Charlie Haughey really was about to get a grip on the economy.
Des O'Malley was somewhere abroad leading a trade mission or an IDA mission, and was absolutely horrified when his private secretary rang him to say that this idiot in Kildare had put down this motion of conflict with Charlie Haughey. He knew nothing about it.
I was in bed, not asleep, but sick with diarrhea because I got Spanish tummy. The phone rang, and I was told that McCreevy had put down a motion of no confidence.
What was your real motive in calling this vote?
Just give us a quick word.
Mr. O'Malley, perhaps you could give us some comment.
I said, well, why the hell did you do this? And he said, I'm fed up of it all. I wanted to bring it to a head. He used a few expletives about it. Something about shitting or getting off the pot.
I didn't care, because one thing I was made up, there was going to be a bloody vote. And this time we weren't going to back off, and there was.
Taoiseach, are you confident about tonight's meeting?
This was the beginning of one of the darkest episodes in Fianna Fáil's history. Charles Haughey was facing the first real threat to his leadership, and survival would mean a bitter fight.
I'm absolutely, totally and completely confident about the outcome.
You're confident that you will win, Taoiseach?
Yes, certainly.
Once you're the leader, you didn't have to put up with any nonsense. People who posed any threat to you had to be dealt with, whatever it took.
Whatever tactics he used was all through other people. He never encouraged us to do anything. We came together as a group, and we knew what had to be done.
All of his supporters are on the phone telling you that you're a traitor and you're a disgrace. They would be extremely abusive, and I did feel intimidated and I did feel afraid.
Let's say we persuaded some.
I saw grown men break down and cry. I saw people, they were in fear of their livelihoods and their families, and the pressure was absolutely immense.
If you can't stand the heat in the kitchen, leave the kitchen. This is not for beginners. National politics.
People rang my house saying he'd be knocked off coming home to dual carriage with all that type of thing.
Well, I was tailed around the city, phone calls through the night. They could be just from supporters, you never know. I mean, I can't say that Charlie Haughey knew of any of these things.
My phone was interfered with, and there were periods when it was obvious that my house was under surveillance.
They wanted to believe that I was some kind of malign figure, you know, locked away in, you know, his mansion, you know, plotting badness. I didn't believe it then, and I don't believe it now.
On October 6th, the party debated McCreevy's motion late into the night. It was pushed to an open vote, which Haughey won easily. Afterwards, his supporters celebrated outside the Dáil.
They'd been drinking around the bars all day in Leinster House, and I remember the captain of the guard saying to me, "I would leave at the back entrance," and I said, "I came in by the front and I'm going out by the front." So just as they'd be out, there was all this roaring and shouting and yahooing and the usual.
As Jim Gibbons was leaving the house that night, a number of men attacked him. Unfortunately, he was saved because a good friend of his happened to be close by, brought a kind of a sword with him, and he just whipped that out and said, "Get off that man or I'll kill every one of you." And that's what saved Jim Gibbons' life. Jim had a heart attack, of course, shortly after that.
Oh, it's all right, relax.
For the second time in 8 months, Haughey had survived, but his past was about to catch up with him. Details of the phone tapping had been leaked to Garrett Fitzgerald.
The guards were deeply unhappy about their politicisation, and that led them to give information to the opposition. I think you can't have a state in which the police are so alienated from what they see as corruption in government that they start coming to the opposition. The country shouldn't run like that.
I know that at that time that there were some people in the army, right, who were worried about how solid the state was.
By November 82, the wheels were set in motion. The Workers' Party had withdrawn their support for Haughey over his tough economic plans. Fitzgerald saw his chance and tabled a motion of no confidence.
On the day the government fell, I just said that Haughey had acted with honour and integrity towards me and towards the arrangements that he had made. People got houses and a lot of people got jobs in the north inner city and in other areas. He came up and he just thanked me for what I said, and I said the only reason I said it is because it was true. And you know it's true, so it's no big deal.
And indeed, with us in Studio 1, the Taoiseach.
3 weeks later, at the end of a gruelling election campaign, Charles Haughey watched as his chances of staying in office drained away.
Indications are that Fianna Fáil cannot form a single-party overall majority government.
We see that there is a swing against the government.
The kind of alternative to be talked about would be a coalition. As you know, the sort of situation that you're now in, Sligo, Leitrim. But here's the third time round you've been refused. That's never happened. That is unprecedented for a leader of Fianna Fáil.
I fought a good fight in adverse circumstances.
After just 9 months in government, Haughey was out once more. And as he faced into opposition, the new Taoiseach, Garrett Fitzgerald, prepared to reveal the secrets that could bring him down. Secrets of his Gubu government were about to catch up with him. The new Fine Gael-led coalition was preparing to break one of the biggest scandals in Irish political history.
I'm going to cabinet meeting. Will there be resignation?
Garda Deputy Commissioner Joseph Ainsworth and Commissioner Patrick McLaughlin to quit the
Gardaí
force.
have retired.
Recording a political conversation.
Legal crisis in the Republic.
Mr. Doherty initiated both taps. The checks and balances which should operate within the system no longer operated.
That was a pretty serious thing to the security and to the democracy of the state, that the people would know that these things were happening.
I came out with the view that on the principle of ultimate responsibility, that Mr. Haughey, as leader of the party, had ultimate responsibility for what did happen.
As the phone tapping scandal broke, another secret recording was about to surface. This time, money was at the centre of the controversy.
Rumours had been doing the rounds that certain supporters of Charlie Haughey were financially beholden to him. Ray McSharry's name was being mentioned. Martin O'Donoghue was reported as saying to some, if Ray McSharry is a problem, we can sort it out for him.
While there was no evidence to back up the rumours, they sparked a dramatic sequence of events.
Well, McSharry was furious. Absolutely furious.
So Ray McSharry decided that to have solid evidence, he would need to have a recording.
In October '82, Ray McSharry used Garda equipment to record a conversation with fellow Minister Martin O'Donoghue.
We went to McSharry to talk about what about trying to arrange a change of leadership. Haughey had a lot of financial problems, couldn't prove it, but to me that made it all the more important that he should go quickly as leader before he did even more damage.
It seemed now that the spotlight was about to be turned on Haughey's finances.
Both Ray McSharry and Sean Doherty went in to see Mr. Haughey. And after a couple of minutes, Ray McSharry came out and said, "Catherine, Mr. Haughey is not feeling very well, will you come in?" Ray McSharry had told him that he had recorded a meeting with Martin O'Donoghue. Mr. Haughey was shaking and stunned, absolutely stunned.
Haughey had reason to worry. In early '83, journalists were drawing closer to the truth about his finances.
There was one guy in AIB who was going around town telling everybody who was prepared to listen that Haughey had a situation with AIB and owed $1 million.
And if he'd owed $1 million, and if you could write the story, he then would be a bankrupt, so he couldn't be a member of the Dáil. That was the political implication of it as well. And I went to check out that story, and eventually got it confirmed satisfactorily from within the bank.
The story of Haughey's debt was published in the evening press. He was now under attack from all sides. When the inevitable leadership challenge came in February, Haughey's time, it seemed, was up.
It was very, very bad, the bugging of the journalists' telephones. So I decided then that I was going to put down the motion calling on Charlie to resign.
It was absolutely touch and go. I remember going in one morning and being handed a draft resignation statement and asked to complete it.
What was the mood of Mr. Haughey last night?
Great, not bother on him.
Confident?
Yeah. I think he felt alone and isolated, and was almost to the point where I would say we thought that that was it.
Do you think Mr. Haughey will remain as leader?
Be his decision anyway, that's for sure.
And I think everybody had written Mr. Haughey off, and I think he was actually quite close to resignation at one stage. But then he, in an instant, I think, decided to fight back.
Charles Haughey once told me that nothing is impossible, the impossible just takes a little bit longer.
Haughey was going to fight, but he needed time to rally his troops before the next parliamentary party meeting.
Something happened that made it possible for Charlie Haughey to regain the ground. Clem Coughlin, TD, was tragically killed in a car accident, and the parliamentary party meeting was adjourned.
The chairman, Jim Tunney, who was being snarled at by Haughey to adjourn the meeting, and finally he adjourned it, running out the door and shouting back in Irish that the meeting was adjourned for a week.
And we had time to organise.
With the meeting postponed, the fight back began. First, the stories about his finances.
The banks usually don't comment on newspaper stories about their clients. But in this instance, the bank did issue a statement. It gave the distinct impression that the story was wrong and that Haughey hadn't had this huge overdraft. We don't really know how it came about that the bank came to issue this statement.
Sean Doherty would take the fall for the phone tapping.
I have no knowledge whatever of any of these activities, and I know nothing about them.
Sean Doherty said to me, he says, "I carried the can for all this, you know." And I said, "I know you did." His reputation was absolutely and utterly destroyed by it.
Doherty was disappointed and continued to be disappointed for a long time.
The external threats had been seen off. Haughey now turned to his party.
I said to him, we haven't enough candidates in the list looking for your job. And he said, "What do you mean?" And I said, we need confusion.
Should the party choose you, a leader is entitled to dignity and loyalty from his party.
Will your hat be in the ring?
Well, I perhaps might say, I must be in a sense, flattered.
Will your hat be in the ring?
Look, there's an old Irish shanachal, you know, that says, "Shahar ska chéile a bhar na daoine."
And of course that added more confusion because you had Jerry Collins as the candidate to Lacey, you had Michael Kennedy, and then you'd have himself. So at that point it kind of helped, you know, focus the parliamentary party's mind that there was going to be this three-way divide, and that wasn't a very healthy thing.
With confusion sown in Leinster House, Haughey made a public appeal to the party grassroots.
Charlie had said that as far as he was concerned, the parliamentary party couldn't fire him, that he was going to call a special Ardèche and they would decide. This is it, the dictatorship has finally arrived, you know.
The days leading up to the vote saw sinister developments. Ben Briscoe, who tabled the no-confidence motion, found his Jewish roots had become a focus of intimidation.
We were ringing up and saying that Hitler should have finished the job. Even on the day of my motion, a Garda car escorted me to Newlands Cross, and then from Newlands Cross another Garda car escorted me to the Dáil. It indicates some of the kind of people who supported him.
On February 7th, the party gathered in Leinster House. Could Haughey beat the odds once more?
People spoke their minds at these meetings, sometimes in a quite vicious way.
You were being accused almost of treason, and you know that you had no valid reason for being worried about him and worried about the style of leadership.
I said, this party has lost its soul. And I said to the party, you know, give us back our soul. I felt that the party had lost everything that it stood for.
I remember after 16 or 17 hours of that meeting, the vote was taken late at night.
Vote was 40 against the motion, 33 for. Accordingly, Mr. Charles J. Haughey remains the democratically elected leader.
No, I'm not going to talk about it now, please.
You're not united behind me anyway.
For the third time in a year, Haughey had survived. But victory had come at a heavy price.
After the result of the heave, when everybody was breaking up, I went into Mr. Haughey and he said, "You want to see me?" And I said, "Yes, I have a short message for you. If there is another heave, I just want to tell you that I will not be supporting you." He said he was sorry to hear it, and that, but he accepted it and thanked me for at least having the decency to come in and tell him to his face. I wouldn't be where I was but for him. I have to leave it for the moment.
Those who sought to weaken or to confuse us have failed.
For the first time, Charles Haughey was the undisputed leader of Fianna Fáil. Dissent had been virtually silenced, at least for now.
He had now been endorsed by the party on 3 occasions, so I just gave up. I said, look, I have no mandate to carry on, and I wouldn't be troubling him anymore.
People had said to me that Charlie was a very vindictive man and he would never forgive me. Charlie did not show any vindictiveness towards me. If he had, I would never have become Lord Mayor of Dublin. He was the supreme politician.
But Haughey had one last piece of unfinished business.
There was constant feeling of awful, sort of gut-wrenching tension. The whole thing was terribly unpleasant. And you were, wishing to goodness it could get itself resolved one way or another.
For 2 years, Haughey bided his time. In February 1985, he chose his moment to strike.
It came to a vote on a family planning bill, which they wanted to oppose at all costs. They told me that I had to vote against it, and I said I wasn't prepared to do it. So I didn't.
In fact, he went to the races in Leopardstown that afternoon when the vote was taking place.
I could see by that stage that the bill was going to pass, and I felt I'd made my point.
Haughey summoned O'Malley to a meeting of the party's national executive. Now they would decide his future.
What's your feeling going into the meeting? Are you confident?
I'm not confident, no.
Is this not all pre-decided? Not at all. How could it be pre-decided? He gets his opportunity, he's been summoned, he's going to appear, I take it, and make his point of view. Here was a man who had done all of this unbelievable damage to the party. A lot of people felt it was coming for a long time.
Good evening, Mr. Haughey. Charlie.
I discovered, of course, that the chief judge, Mr. Haughey, who was presiding at the National Executive, was also the chief prosecutor.
Charlie summed up in support of the motion, saying that basically enough was enough.
Emmett's speech from the dock wouldn't have saved me that night, because it was obvious that I was a goner.
The motion was put to a vote and was 6 or 7 votes in favour of Dessie O'Malley and something over 60 in favour of his expulsion.
I hope that's not conduct unbecoming now.
I was glad to be free. I couldn't stick it any longer. People like me no longer had any real influence within the party. And if you were going to do something for the country, you would have to do it from outside.
I had to go to break the news to a rather unsympathetic political correspondence audience. From here on in, I said, it's uno duce, una voce. One leader, one voice, remember that. And I started goose-stepping up and down the power room. A total piss take. I mean, I didn't mean it. No, everybody knew I didn't mean it. But Geraldine, Madame, was there with a pen. She wrote it down. But the following Tuesday, the cruiser was writing. And of course, he said, now we know the truth. The mask has slipped, the real voice of Haughey is revealed. Charlie didn't pick it up for a long time. So one day, anyway, he said, by the way, that uno duce una voce thing, what is it, he said. I said, it's Italian, sir. He said, I know it's fucking Italian, he said, but who said it? And I said, Mussolini. He said, oh, Jesus Christ, you really are out to ruin me, aren't you? And I said,
I belong to a race of people that have been on this island for a very, very long time.
Adrift in opposition, Haughey used the time to cultivate his image as a man concerned with loftier ideals than mere politics.
Under Bearben Bulben's head, in Drumcliff churchyard, Yeats is laid. An ancestor was rector there, long years ago. A church stands near.
It's the kind of stuff that Haughey had crammed his memory full of. The importance of, Irish identity and Irish heritage and culture and all this sort of vacuous stuff,
Patrick Pearse was an idealist, a visionary, a revolutionary. Such men were dangerous to empires.
He was very reflective about politics, about public life, about public affairs. He thought a lot about what kind of things that he would like to do, were he back in government, all of that kind of thing.
Yeah. The other way round. The other way round.
Quick look in here first.
Oh, in here, sorry. Yes.
While Garret Fitzgerald's government floundered, Haughey could afford to stand back from the fray. But when the Fine Gael leader had a rare success with the Anglo-Irish agreement, Haughey's sharp political instincts re-emerged.
As leader of the opposition, I see it as a national political disaster. I know from the general public point of view there's a widespread feeling of anger and resentment and humiliation.
His opposition to the agreement was a mistake. Sending Brian Lennon to America to propose it was a mistake, and from his point of view as well as from the country's point of view. I don't think he had a sufficient understanding of the complexity of the Northern Ireland situation. He's reacting emotionally to it.
I think one would have to say that, and you know, I bear some responsibility for this as well, since I was advising him at the time. We misread the Anglo-Irish agreement, and I think there was a certain price, a certain political price, paid for that.
Haughey played politics with the agreement, but behind the scenes he was about to embark on a high-risk northern strategy. The key figure behind the initiative tells the story of Haughey's secret talks for the first time.
I'm a Redemptorist. I live in Clonard Monastery off the Falls Road, which was right in the centre of the conflict. We used to go to the funerals of everybody as far as we could, you know, and we saw, and we meeting the victims, the wives, and the mothers and fathers, and felt we had a responsibility to do something about it. From the word go, really, we were trying to get the Dublin government involved. And at that time, nobody would talk to Sinn Féin unless the IRA stopped. Our early efforts failed, so I decided that what I was going to do was going to write to Mr. Haughey. I remember saying, this is the last throw of the dice. We've nowhere else to go after this. If this doesn't work, that's it.
There was a possibility that if we pursue this initiative, it could work. Even if the odds were against one, if there was a reasonable chance, it was worth it.
Then I got word to go, it was a Saturday morning, to go to Kinseely to meet him. And I must have talked for an hour or more. Mr. Haughey never said anything, he just sat there. He was a very good listener, just sat there, and his expression was encouraging, you know what I mean? You know, he had a positive attitude, a friendly attitude, an interested attitude.
Haughey would later instruct Martin Mansur to begin a secret dialogue with Sinn Féin. It was a key moment in the fledgling peace process.
He was taking a very big political risk. There could have been, at the very least, an enormous furore if it had become public, but it didn't become public.
Basically, he said, like John Hume, he was going to support this. He was going to help us.
But Haughey could do little while he remained in opposition. His chance came in early '87.
The general election will take place on Tuesday, 17th February, and New Dáil will resume on the 10th of March.
Fly me to the moon and let me play among the stars. Let me see what spring is like on Jupiter and Mars. In other words, hold my hand. In other words, darling, kiss me.
One major obstacle, however, stood in Haughey's way.
Introducing Des O'Malley, the leader of the Progressive Democrats.
Founded by O'Malley in 1986, the Progressive Democrats had already poached TDs from Fianna Fáil.
Really thrilled, of course, that Bobby Malloy has joined us.
Now the PDs threaten to take Fianna Fáil seats in the election.
Fianna Fáil government with a majority, yes.
Mary Harney has topped the poll.
The PDs are firmly established west of the Shannon.
PDs truly have broken the mould here.
We'll win something in the region of 14, 15, 16.
I'm sure you must find that disappointing.
I would imagine we would have done a great deal better had they not done so well.
They got 14 seats. And they denied Fianna Fáil the majority on that occasion, in simple terms.
But despite the PD's success, O'Malley failed to keep Haughey out of power. With the support of independents, Fianna Fáil formed a minority government. As Haughey settled back into office, some unfinished business remained. Once again, his personal finances needed attention. Des Traynor went looking for money.
Des contacted me and he said that Charlie had a financial problem. He owed money to the banks, I think in the order of $1 million or 1.2 million, etc. And he was looking for a number of donors to put up 200,000.
They were putting a consortium together of 10 people. And I said, if you're putting a consortium together, I think you should make it as few as possible, because I had a great belief, and still have, that Christ picked 12 apostles and one of them crucified him.
Haughey could not know it, but the solution to his financial problems would one day cost him everything.
It was agreed that I would make available $1 million.
All the bets are paid, Pete. All your bets are paid.
By the 1990s, Charles Haughey's era was drawing to a close. The final acts of triumph and betrayal were about to be played out.
There would be the darker side. There is the darker side.
It was the time which I felt as low about anything in all of my political life.
We should have told the PDs to fuck off.
I think he felt totally betrayed by the state.
He's confronted with the trust of simple people whom he really has probably betrayed.
In 1987, Charles Haughey was back in power after 5 years in opposition. This was his last chance to fulfill his early promise. Failure and scandal had engulfed his first 2 periods as Taoiseach.
Haughey was a different man, and when he came in, he made one of the most devastating addresses to the new government.
The Taoiseach said there will be blood from now on for quite a while on the carpet in the cabinet room, so kind of brace yourself, Bridget.
He was working under a huge threat, and the threat was the bankruptcy of the country.
It's going to be tough, it's going to be difficult, and there will be setbacks, but we're going to see it through.
And then he cut.
Hospital wards were closed. I mean, this was something unthinkable.
Cutting back on civil servants, cutting back on housing grants.
We'll stop the trains at Athlone, they won't go to Galway. That's how we'll save money in transport. I remember that one.
Oh, goodness, it was terrible.
Mr. Haughey was continuously heckled and...
Despite the turmoil, Haughey secured support for his tough economic plans from the unions and then, remarkably, from Fine Gael.
Surrounded the Taoiseach's car. A number of tomatoes were also thrown.
At 62, Haughey knew he had little time to lose.
Was on duty to protect the Taoiseach.
He was so determined to get things done in the most efficient way, in the shortest possible time. He had no time for bullshit whatsoever.
His government lived in fear of him, and that was the only way in which the very, very severe budgetary measures that were taken at that time could have been introduced.
Within 2 years, he had solved the problem of the Irish national debt. It was an extraordinary achievement.
Haughey also wanted to make his mark with grand projects to boost the economy. For years, a plan to turn Dublin's docklands into a global financial centre had failed to take root. Then the man behind the proposal went to Haughey.
Everybody was opposed to it. I went to Charlie and I said to Charlie, everybody's objected to this here. Civil servants, the captains of industry, and I said it's not going to, and I was so frustrated. I said, I don't know how anything goes through here. This is ridiculous. So he just laughed at me. He said, I'll attend the next meeting. He listened to them all, he made his judgment, and he said, I've listened to you, it's taken place, it's going to be in the finance bill, you shall not block it.
Within a few years, the International Financial Services Centre was generating hundreds of millions for the Exchequer. For Haughey, an ambitious initiative of this type had the potential for personal as well as political advantage.
He did come into contact
with a new generation of entrepreneurs and who believed that if he was in power, that he would introduce economic policies that would be to the wider benefit, but also to their benefit.
I remember people at the time in 87, 88 that gave Charlie money, and they said to Charlie, here's 50,000, here's 100,000, do whatever you like with it. For me, he believed in the IFSC, so what he looks for me, I'm more happy to give it to him. Then, and now, and in the future.
Secure in power, Haughey's personal finances were flourishing, thanks to donations from businessmen. Now he could afford to relax and enjoy his new role on the international stage.
He actually groomed himself to be a statesman. He sort of acted the part of a statesman and became that.
I personally have introduced certain aspects of French culture and protocol into the business of government. My ministers have to kiss me on both cheeks before cabinet meetings. Afterwards, I help them to their feet and we get on with the business of running this country.
Haughey defied his critics by spending over £17 million, bringing the dilapidated government buildings up to a standard befitting his stature.
He loved the sense of meeting with these people. He gained considerable status because he was meeting with Cole and he was meeting with Thatcher and he was meeting with Mitterrand and all the rest of them. He got on very well with Mitterrand. The two shared many preoccupations. At the meeting, Mitterrand, who was a gamey sort of a fellow, had 3 beautiful women with him. You could see Charlie's mind wasn't totally on what Mitterrand was saying.
Haughey had acquired some of the other trappings of the European statesman, however. For years he had been conducting an affair. Terry Keane, a fashion journalist, had been introduced to Haughey in the 1960s. In the early 70s, the two began a relationship.
His relationship with Terry Keane was a very expensive one. They went to the most expensive restaurants, they drank the most expensive wines and champagne.
Dear Diary, there's a certain powerful person who'll be receiving all sorts of...
Now in the late 80s, Keane began to drop hints about their affair in her weekly gossip column that were quickly picked up on.
Instead of the beautiful...
No, I'll tell you, will I lash off a line or two to your woman in the endo as well, boss? Always letting on she knows you, constant references to you. Oh, you know her, you know that ill one.
Well, there were always rumours.
For God's sake, man. Anyway, she never leaves you alone. Listen, will I issue a writ, boss, and put manager?
No, that won't be necessary.
I recall once going to car communications in order to get some training, and Terry Prone just sat down in front of me and said, well now, Sean, what about your father's affair? How are you going to handle that? And I was kind of speechless for a while. I said, what do I say here? Do I let on I don't know about it? And does that make me look like a total idiot? Do I say to her, maybe, well, I had suspicions or what? So I sat there speechless for a minute.
Rumours flourished, but for now, Haughey's affair with Keane would remain just a subject of gossip and innuendo. Charles Haughey was keeping other secrets. In 1987, he was preparing to become the first Taoiseach to meet with the leadership of the Republican movement. The Belfast priest, Father Alec Reid, was behind the initiative.
I went to Cardinal O'Fee and asked him if he would host a meeting between John Hume, Gerry Adams and Mr. Haughey. So then we arranged for a time and a date.
Remember, I mean, to even hold such meetings was completely taboo and against the orthodoxy that, you know, you don't talk to terrorists. There's no question that he was taking a very big political risk.
At the last minute, however, the meeting was postponed when it looked like John Hume might be delayed in Brussels.
But the next thing that happened then, within about 10 days, Enniskillen.
The bomb had been planted at a community centre close to the War Memorial.
It really frightened Mr. Haughey, because you can see, if it got out that he was meeting, people were blowing up civilians in Enniskillen. I think he may have thought that the whole thing was a plot, you know?
But Haughey held his nerve and authorised secret talks between the government and Sinn Féin.
It was a risk for Charlie Haughey to take, and I think the history books will record that contribution in the sense that they are not going to date the beginnings of the peace process to just Albert Reynolds and later to Bertie Ahern. Haughey's name is going to have to be factored in there.
Eventually, the pressure began to take its toll. In October '88, Haughey was rushed to hospital with breathing problems. The illness was played down, but in fact, Haughey came close to death.
He was very, very seriously ill, at a very low ebb. People came to see him in hospital, and they were very shocked at his appearance and at his weakness and fatigue. And one of the people who held things together for Mr. Haughey was Brian Lenihan.
Haughey and Lenihan had been close since the 1960s, their friendship surviving decades of party infighting. Now, as Haughey recuperated, he discovered Lenihan was suffering from liver disease.
I told him that Brian's only chance was a liver transplant, and Mr. Haughey immediately burst into tears and he wept.
Mr. Haughey called me into his office one day and said, look, Lenihan's in trouble. Go out and raise sufficient money to make sure that it looks after his medical expenses and the other expenses around it.
Kavanagh raised over £150,000 and Lenihan travelled to the US for his operation. But not all the money raised went to Brian Lenihan.
Haughey got in more than was required and he spent the rest of it on himself. He had a very carefree attitude with other people's money.
The Lenihan money was channelled through the party leader's account. This account, funded by the taxpayer, was meant to cover official expenses.
He used it to pay for Charvet shirts in Paris costing £16,000. He used it to pay for dinners in the Coq Ardee restaurant, which cost £15,000. He took £25,000 at one stage and lodged it into his own personal account in Guinness and Mahon.
Don't touch my wheel,
He used the party's money as if it was his own personal money. In doing so, he had the help of the current Taoiseach, Bertie Ahern, because Bertie Ahern and Charles Haughey were co-signatories on the account.
Cheques were usually filled in with the payee and the amount for salaries for the press office, taxi bills, and bills relating to Mr. Haughey for Le Coq Ardee or whatever. And Bertie Ahern would come down to my office and sign them. I once saw him sign an entire book of blank cheques.
Literally, I signed books of cheques. I mean, that was the procedure. I didn't see my role as being the watchdog of what the party leader did with the leaders' fund.
The times are favourable. The opportunity.
As ever, the voters were unaware of exactly how Haughey was using their money. In 1989, his popularity was at a high as the economy began to recover. Haughey saw his chance.
Our spirits are high. Let us take the tide at the flood.
In April, his minority government was defeated in a Dáil vote. It was an embarrassment, though not necessarily grounds for an election. But Haughey and a few colleagues thought otherwise.
I remember Ray Burke was very keen on having it. And Pádraig Flynn, I think they both were pushing the idea, yes, let's go to the country, swagger, swagger, let's show what a wonderful people we all are.
Do you think you get an overall majority?
Well, that's the general objective, yes.
But could there have been another potential advantage to calling an election?
Fianna Fáil was more popular with the business classes than perhaps it had been for a very long time. So there was a lot of money there for Fianna Fáil to tap.
We had collected about the 1.7 million, but we had spent 2.3 million.
Jeez, don't let me Charlie jumped off.
Frankly, we never realised how much was going astray at the time.
Certain cabinet ministers received huge donations. Ray Burke kept £20,000 meant for Fianna Fáil, and Pádraig Flynn accepted £50,000 from a developer. He disputes this was meant for the party.
He gave it to me for the simple reason that he stated to me personally. He liked me, and he wanted me to have a successful campaign, and he wanted me to succeed in politics. That was it. Simple as that.
I suppose that they lived in a culture where Mr. Haughey was doing what he was doing. They were junior to him, and they would say to themselves, well, if this is happening at the top, why can't I avail of these facilities as well? So I suppose that's the environment now in retrospect that they lived in.
Haughey's own election dividend came courtesy of Irish Permanent, whose chief executive gave him a cheque for £30,000.
20,000 of which was meant for Brian Lenihan, ended up in accounts belonging to Celtic Helicopters, the company owned by Charles Haughey's son.
And on the day of the poll, Mark Kavanagh, who had developed the IFSC, says he gave Haughey £100,000, the bulk of which was meant for the party.
I wasn't aware at the time that he'd given 100,000 in. Mr. Haughey gave us a cheque for 25,000, made it out to Fianna Fáil, which we lodged in our account. And at the time, we assumed that was what Mark Kavanagh had given him.
The story of the election, of course, is how it's changed since '87. Fianna Fáil are down 5.1. Owen Ryan, Fianna Fáil.
It was the only gain Haughey would make from the '89 election.
Dick Roach of Fianna Fáil, still a little bit of work to do. And look at the gains. The right going to the left.
You called it, you didn't have to, you made a judgment, it was a political judgment and it backfired.
Absolutely. Well, absolutely right. It was a political judgment.
See, what people were worried about was why the election was being called at all, and what was the real motivation behind it.
How do we get a government out of this election?
Well, I think a government will have to be got from it.
When the results were all in, for me, it was very simple. It was a matter of arithmetic. We had 77 seats, they have 6, 83. Which do you prefer, folks? Being in government or being on the other side howling at the moon? And it was a no-brainer.
I don't like coalition governments. I don't think they're the best option.
If whatever bigger step it was for Haughey, in my view, was a bigger step for O'Malley. Because he had founded a party. Their whole raison d'etre was anti-Charlie Haughey.
We were faced with the rather bleak prospect that we either tried to negotiate a coalition government or we went and had another general election.
Fine Gael, maybe? Could you talk to them again?
No, I couldn't. I'm talking.
In my view, he didn't have any ideological mistrust of it, but he didn't think he could carry the Fianna Fáil party.
Well, I had taken a position from the very start that I wasn't in favour of coalition with the PDs. But he appointed Bertie Ahern and myself to do the negotiations.
Nothing is ruled in, nothing is ruled out.
But Albert copped on after a few days that there was other things going on that he knew nothing about.
A lot of the decisions had been made without our knowledge.
Behind the scenes, Haughey did a deal directly with O'Malley. He would take his party into coalition with or without the approval of his negotiators.
He shook hands with me when the thing was finally agreed, and he made some remark about, I think he and nobody else might have been able to achieve this. I just gritted my teeth and said, well, we'll get on with it now, and I hope it works out.
Before the end of the negotiations, before we were finished anyway, I got a phone call from Charlie at one stage who said that the deal had been finalised. Sick was the only way I could say it, and I think there were others who were sick too.
I regarded single-party government as a core value of the Fianna Fáil party.
Power, getting power, keeping power, that was it. And he had to be in government at any price.
For the first time in its history, Fianna Fáil entered into coalition. But in breaking his party's core value, Haughey had alienated two powerful figures within the ranks of his own cabinet.
The PDs done us. And they wouldn't have if he had taken my bloody advice on that day in the office in 1989. I said, we'll have them out inside 18 months and we'll be back with an overall majority. And he didn't want to risk it. And he only said to me, all the bets are paid, Pete. All your bets are paid. In other words, I owe you nothing, you owe me nothing. I said, this is a dirty little deal. And he only said to me, yes, I'll hold you responsible for none of it.
Despite all predictions to the contrary, the Fianna Fáil PD coalition seemed remarkably stable. Haughey and O'Malley proved able to do business together.
In a sense, you had to take Haughey at two levels. You knew that he was an outrageous rogue, but just on a purely personal level, he was a personable individual, and he had a certain amount of style and could be quite entertaining.
In 1990, Charles Haughey was widely praised for his handling of the EU presidency. Now he seemed set for another triumph, with Brian Lenihan as the party's candidate for the Irish presidency.
I think that was probably the worst campaign ever. And the whole thing was pretty nasty. There were some awful things said.
It was the time which I felt as low about anything that in all of my political life.
I think expediency won over what was right. I deeply regret that now.
Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Questions and Answers.
On October 22nd, Lenihan was making a scheduled appearance on RTE.
He's probably the most popular politician in Leinster House.
Halfway through, a member of the audience asked a seemingly innocuous question.
Did he make a phone call or phone calls to Áras an Uachtaráin in that period in February 1982?
The allegation was that Brian Lenihan had rung Áras an Uachtaráin looking for Patrick Hillery and was asking him not to dissolve the Dáil in 1982 when the Fine Gael Labour government collapsed, and to allow Fianna Fáil to come into office without having an election.
No, I didn't at all. That never happened.
And to my astonishment, Brian Lenihan said he hadn't. Well, I had to say that's wrong. Excuse me, I was in Áras an Uachtaráin when those phone calls came through, and I know how many there were.
I don't know who they were from in any way.
Now, there was nothing very serious about that. I think Brian Lenihan or anybody else was perfectly entitled to convey a message to the President.
But Lenihan's honesty was about to be called into question. 6 months earlier, he'd told student Jim Duffy that he had called the Áras that night in '82. And Duffy had a tape to prove it.
What you made a phone call? Yes, Sylvester Barrett and Mr. Haughey. Yeah, that's right. And did any of the phone calls get through to the President straight?
Oh yeah, I mean, I got through to him, I remember talking to him.
He lied in one or he lied in the other, take your choice. That was what the public believed.
I've never spoken to the President at all in regard to any of the matters that have been suggested.
I got a phone call to say, okay, it's really bad. In the meantime, Sean Dignan was on, and he was presenter at the 6-1 News, and said, Niamh, look, I think that the better way to handle this would be to have Brian come out to the studios in RTE.
Now, is that enough?
Mr. Lenihan,
is that enough?
So we said, yeah, okay, let's go out to the studio, address this once and for all.
I said, look, this is you talking to the nation,
And we knew that he'd handle it, and handle it very well.
On mature recollection at this stage that I did not ring President Hillary.
The words he was saying and the actions were alien to me as being Brian's behaviour.
I did not ring President Hillary on that night.
But I certainly didn't expect him to stare into the camera and frighten the people.
That mature recollection of mine is the correct one.
It was probably a mistake on my part, because it was an interview rather than a piece to camera that you'd be doing.
All of RTE were in the room with me, and they were just shocked.
It's wider than just the presidency. Sean? You've now got the government in problems. Sean? Don't you think in those circumstances?
And that was it, it was over.
They all heard your voice on the tape, so that's the difficulty.
Lenihan's campaign was sunk, but now suddenly much more was at stake for Charles Haughey.
Dr. Hillary, on the occasion, do you understand plain English?
Because he was a member of the government, it wasn't just a Fianna Fáil matter. We were also in the government.
Have some decorum in this matter.
I felt quite upset if he'd been advised to just admit things as they were and say that he was confused as a result of the illness. The public would have accepted that, and we'd have accepted it.
With the PDs threatening to pull out of government, Haughey had a choice: drop his friend from the cabinet or face a general election. Haughey summoned Lenihan to Kinseely and urged him to resign.
I was there with the two of them. It was a terrible meeting, and I remember it very, very clearly. But Charlie felt he had to act. Brian understood that.
Did he offer his resignation, Mr. Haughey?
Oh no. Nor did I seek it. Nor did I seek it.
Later that day, a letter of resignation was handed to Brian Lenihan.
My father was to take full responsibility for everything, and it was like almost a suicide note. When the letter was shown to my mother on the campaign bus, she just simply looked at it and said, tore it in 2 pieces or 3 pieces and said, "You're not signing that, Brian."
Not resigning. I don't have any obligation to do so until I am elected president. Then I will do so.
But of course, that didn't stop the pressure from Mr. Haughey's direction.
And he went missing down to Athlone. The Taoiseach wanted to talk to him and he couldn't contact him. And he was highly annoyed about that. So he asked myself and Albert to go down and get him back.
We were aware of the crowds massing in Athlone and of the tensions which were running very high when up drew the ministerial car and Pádraig Flynn.
And she was not kind to us.
"I'm your friend," he said. "And Brian's friend. I'm coming to Athlone to help to smooth matters."
She told us where to go in no uncertain terms.
And I said, "You, F-U-C-K, across the Shannon, and never let me see you again."
And we tried to explain to her, but she wasn't for listening.
They both scarpered, they did. You couldn't have gone into that crowd. You just couldn't. They couldn't. Anyway.
But Haughey kept up the pressure, dispatching a helicopter to a house in the Midlands where Lenihan was staying.
We decided we'd buzz the house with the helicopter. So that was fine. So we got into the helicopter and we're circling the house.
My father was upstairs in an upstairs bedroom. he sort of woke up and there was the undercarriage of a helicopter right outside his window. And of course, he later came down to breakfast and said that it was sort of like a Vietnam movie rather than a presidential election.
Then one of the other guys on the helicopter decided, "Oh, I have a good idea. Why don't we try and climb out of the helicopter and into the window?" Now at that, I said, "No, okay, the madness here stops."
But it sort of indicated, the sort of relentless effort Charlie would always put into to get his way.
Back in Dublin, with the PDs on the brink of quitting the government, Haughey reached a decision. If Lenihan wouldn't resign, he would sack him.
I was opposed to it and asked that if the PDs came looking for his head on a plate, would he be as willing to cooperate?
All politicians will do things to hold on to power that, are harsh, cruel sometimes. And that was one of those.
The army motorcycle escort that would carry messages in a brown bag around to ministers arrived with the letter of dismissal saying that he was dismissed from the government. So we looked at the letter and travelled into the Dáil.
I regret to have to inform the House that this evening I requested the Taoiseach and Minister for Defence, Mr. Brian Lenihan TD, to resign as a member of the government and that he failed to comply with this request. Accordingly, I propose to exercise my constitutional prerogative to advise the President to terminate his appointment as a member of the government.
Here was the man that had defended the party through thick and thin, and we had to do this to him.
I think half we had, told the PDs to fuck off, that we weren't going to go that far, that they might have blinked. And I deeply regret that now.
My father had felt very let down at being dismissed. I think he felt that, very damaged as a person as a result of it.
Leaving the Dáil there that night, and I remember saying, I think this is everyone well worth it.
Our first ever woman president.
For many in Fianna Fáil, Haughey's decision to sack Lenihan was unforgivable. By sacrificing his friend to stay in power, Haughey had perhaps sealed his own fate.
I would hope that anything untoward or hurtful or wounding will now be put aside and forgotten.
The way in which he disposed of even former friends and colleagues like Brian Lenihan suggested that really there wasn't any core. It was just layers and layers of onion that you peeled back until there was nothing at all left within.
Inspired to bring down Haughey.
By 1991, Charles Haughey had been leader of Fianna Fáil for 11 years. Now many began to think about life after him, and one man in particular was impatient for change.
It's obvious to me, he says, that you want to become leader of this party. I said, yeah, sometime. He says, you're going to wait a while. Good while.
Charlie Haughey had done such an exceptionally good job. The economy was growing. He had made it. And I thought surely now that he would certainly be contemplating moving on.
As Reynolds prepared the ground, Haughey began to falter. In the autumn of '91, the darker side of the new money economy began to reveal itself.
Allegations of irregularities in Goodman Meat Plant.
This whole Greencore affair is a highly irregular transaction.
Current controversy
In the interest of the company, tendered his resignation.
It sort of confirmed suspicions that all was not well in corporate Ireland, that anybody who could make a quick buck was out to make a quick buck.
He rejected suggestions of there being a stench of corruption about, but said the government was determined.
The controversy centres around the extension of a sewerage pipe next to the Taoiseach's lands at
Surrounding the sale of the Johnston, Mooney and O'Brien site to Telecom Éireann.
That was a very, very complicated property deal in which involved Telecom buying a site at a vastly inflated price.
Today, Michael Smurford resigned from Telecom.
But it became clear that Dermot Desmond had made a substantial profit in the middle of the deal, and money from those profits was used to refurbish Charles Haughey's yacht.
According to Desmond, the £75,000 used for refurbishing Celtic Mist was a loan.
I'm quite happy to have given Conor Haughey money for Celtic Mist for the refurbishment. If Charlie came along to me tomorrow morning and wanted $1 million or $2 million, I'd only be delighted to give it to him.
This is a government of absolute integrity.
When a Prime Minister lies to Parliament,
Deputy Sprigg, making groundless, false allegations.
I put it to you, sir, that you should resign from your office.
And then Charlie gave a rather cheeky comment, throwaway line in the interview on RTE on Sunday.
How much longer do you want to lead Fianna Fáil?
Well, some of those Chinese leaders, stay on till about they're 80 and 90. I think that would be probably a bit long.
I tend to think that some of them kind of believed that, and it sent a chill down their spine. And then they started getting busy.
There seemed to be an accumulation of one thing after the other. I just felt that something needed to be done, and somebody needed to take a stand.
Within days, Noel Dempsey and 3 other backbenchers called on Haughey to go.
Deputies of the Parliamentary Party hereby resolve by secret ballot to discontinue the leadership forthwith of Charles J. Haughey.
Taoiseach, can I ask you if you regard this afternoon's statement as a challenge to your leadership?
Please, with your mind.
I had no idea. In fact, I was walking out the door to go to Longford to do a presentation of tidy towns.
And I said, well, Albert, as I see it, if you don't stand up and be counted this time, you will never lead the Fianna Fáil party.
There's nothing personal in this against the Taoiseach of the day, certainly not. But I have a responsibility to, as I said, to say what I believe is right.
He phoned me to say that he had heard that I was supporting the vote of no confidence, and he said, you know what that means, you have to be removed from office. I says, that's fine. Goodbye, good luck.
Albert Reynolds had another powerful ally in Cabinet.
There comes a time when a change is necessary, and I believe that change is now. And it wasn't easy for me to make that final decision. There was a personal conversation between the two of us, pretty blunt and straight. And he dismissed me. I'm sure it was painful for him, but by Jove, it was painful for me.
Well, Porrick is Porrick, isn't he? And he made a decision that he wanted to be part of a new gang. I think his behaviour was ghastly.
But Haughey, it seemed, had little to worry about. Although 2 senior ministers were calling for him to go, the rest of the Cabinet rallied round.
What Albert is doing now is so wrong that he should, even at this late stage, pull back from wrecking the government and throwing the country into a state of panic and chaos.
The whole leadership issue and battle was unnecessary. And I knew when he came back from the summer's holidays in 91 that he wasn't going to stay long. But he wasn't going to go down on a challenge to the party, having won 3.
On the night, Haughey won the vote easily by a margin of over 2-1. But unknown to Haughey, Reynolds had advised his supporters not to reveal their hand.
Don't vote for me because I said I'm not going to win. And there's no point in exposing the votes we have. The next day will be the day, not today.
Has the party been damaged?
Not in the least. Aren't you pleased?
You think it can survive?
Aren't you pleased?
We won it so convincingly that I felt that was the end of it.
A few days after the vote, the businessman Ben Dunn visited Haughey. Dunn was carrying 3 bank drafts worth over £200,000, intended for members of the Dunn family.
He was feeling low on my opinion. The drafts were in the back of my pocket, and I said, look, there you are. There's something for yourself. And he put his hand out, and he said, thanks. I think he might have said, thanks a million, big fella.
This was the first time that Haughey is known to have accepted money directly from the businessman. Dunn's apparently impulsive act would later prove central to uncovering the secrets of Haughey's wealth.
Peter, can I ask you how you're feeling this morning?
I am.
In the short term, however, other events from Haughey's past were about to resurface. In early 1992, his time in power was drawing to a close.
And that was a very kind of an uncertain time, hugely uncertain. Is Albert Reynolds going to mount another challenge? Is Charlie Haughey going to go? What's going to happen?
My deduction was that in some way, whatever plan was in place involved Dr. John O'Connell.
Dr. John O'Connell, the Fianna Fáil TD, was familiar with some of Haughey's private business transactions. In 1985, he had been the conduit for a payment to Haughey of £50,000 from Mahmoud Fustok, a wealthy Saudi Arabian. The payment was reportedly for a horse. Now, in January 92, Dr. O'Connell and Haughey had a number of meetings.
Dr. John O'Connell called in to see me to say that he would like to see Mr. Haughey also. He told me he was going to urge Mr. Haughey to retire as Taoiseach and from politics because he was very concerned about him, concerned about his health.
Haughey may well have feared that disclosure from any source of a payment such as the one from Fustok had the potential to ruin him. Speaking on the record for the first time, Dr. O'Connell has confirmed that he held another crucial meeting with Haughey that month. The meeting, at the home of a friend in Sutton, was described as not amicable. O'Connell denies that the Fustok payment was discussed, but states that he did speak to Haughey about his health and of discontent within the party. Crucially, O'Connell claims that days later he received a letter from Haughey promising to resign on or around the 22nd of March. Although O'Connell was in contact with Albert Reynolds at the time, both men are adamant that they were not working together to bring Haughey down.
Well, I don't know whoever saw me, very much linked to O'Connell, but whoever. You know, at that time, all sorts of rumours went out, all sorts of rumours. I knew for quite some time that the game was up. It was only a question of calling it at the right time.
And I think into that stepped Sean Doherty.
Well, Doherty had always felt that he was the fall guy for what had gone wrong in the early 1980s, that as Minister for Justice, he had presided over the phone tapping of journalists' phones.
I had isolated him. He was dismissing Doherty. In other words, he wasn't even recognising his bloody existence, you know.
By 1992, Doherty had made a decision that he was no longer prepared to soldier on in silence. In mid-January, he gave an interview to Nighthawks, a late-night talk show.
You took the rap for Charlie Haughey
on the Bogan thing. You bit the bullet.
I had a job to do. There was a decision taken in Cabinet that the prevention of the leaking of matters from Cabinet must be stopped. I, as Minister for Justice, had a direct responsibility for doing that. I did that. I do feel that I was let down by the fact that people knew what I was doing.
Did that betray any...
After the show, Doherty pointed out to presenter Shay Healy that he had said something important. He was now claiming that Haughey had authorised the phone tapping. But was Doherty acting alone?
It was a bombshell. To me, had no idea that Sean Doherty was going to introduce the matter that he did.
And if I had found him before he arrived onto the programme, I'd have asked him, please, please don't. This is not a help. I knew that I had it well and truly wrapped up, and I didn't want any mistakes along the way that might damage the whole effort.
Whether or not Doherty was part of a wider plan, his Nighthawks revelations took on a life of their own. Days after his appearance, the former Justice Minister went a step further.
Each and every one of these relevant transcripts were transported by me to Mr. Haughey's office and handed to him directly.
Suddenly, Haughey was fighting for his political life. In an ominous sign, his PD coalition partners refused to attend Cabinet the following day. Haughey would have to give answers.
The statements made by Senator Sean Doherty yesterday, to the effect that he showed me transcripts of telephone conversations by two journalists, are absolutely false.
He sat on that platform alone. I was sitting on the side, and none of his colleagues were there, former colleagues.
I wish to state categorically that I was not aware at the time of the tapping of these telephones.
It was pretty obvious Doherty was telling the truth. You know, I said, kind of, well, Charlie, it can't go on that type of way.
Yesterday I resigned from the office of Taoiseach by placing my resignation in the hands of the President pursuant to the Constitution.
Yeah, the atmosphere was a bit that of Shakespearean tragedy.
The years during which Deputy Haughey was the central figure on the Irish political stage were marked by a series of controversial anomalies and questions, the kind of questions that can only be answered in the cooler light of history.
And a lot of Shakespeare was quoted across the dial.
Mark Antony saying, I've come to bury Caesar, not to praise him, but the Ides of March are not yet upon us.
The speech Haughey quoted ends with Othello killing himself.
I have done the state some service. They know it. No more of that.
It is a statement of pride, but also, I think, of bitterness.
If I were to seek any accolade as I leave office, it would simply be he served the people, all the people, to the best of his ability.
He walked back to his office. The next thing is there's a knock on the door, and it was Brian Lenihan. He was the only person who came back, and Brian says, he says, there they all are. They're running around out there, he says, like headless chickens. The bland leading the bland. I always remember him saying that.
And I asked Mr. Haughey if he would remain a little while longer in the office, that the cleaning staff wished to see him. And he said, certainly. When he opened the gift which they had given him, which was a mass bouquet, to have a mass said for him all the days of his life. And he sobbed, I sobbed. It was just amazing.
All that remained now was for Haughey to ensure that the secrets of his time in government went with him. Before he left, the leader's accounts files were removed. They have never been traced.
I was very depressed about the future. It looked as if the things that I knew about with moral certainty were never going to be exposed, and that the rot would spread, and it did spread.
To have lived through those 12, 13 years, it had excitement, it had drama, skullduggery, loyalty, disloyalty. It had everything. and it can never and never will be repeated again.
The former Taoiseach lent his support to National Tea Day, the main fundraising event of the Alzheimer's Society of Ireland.
Well, everybody was worried about how he would cope with retirement. My mother said, what am I going to do with my, with my husband around the house all day under my feet?
Will you welcome, please, Charles J. Haughey.
I think he was very heartened by the people he met. You know, they really gave him a warm welcome. And that certainly heartened him.
Anne Jordan from Dublin says Charles J. Haughey is quite simply the greatest statesman Ireland has ever known. How about that? The phones are hopping.
But eventually, when things were going well, his past caught up with him.
There may be trouble ahead.
11 days after Haughey made his resignation speech in the Dáil, Ben Dunne was in a hotel in Florida.
I had my difficulties, and difficulties is the wrong word.
He took a lot of cocaine. There was a call girl in the room. He seems to have lost control.
Something which humiliated his family members in Dunne Stores. They were absolutely furious with Ben Dunne.
Before the fiddlers have fled.
After a lot of to and fro, I am stripped of my chairmanship, and civil war is the only way I could put it.
So Ben came up with an elaborate plan to try and get money out of the business.
Like, geez, if I'm going down, others are going to go down. So then I decided I had to take my family into court.
He was saying that the Dunn's trust was an absolute fraud. He wanted it broken up. And among the things he said that showed it was a fraud was that he had given more than £1 million to Charles Haughey.
Haughey was tipped off about Ben Dunne's allegations. His secret might be out. He faced ruin. But at the 11th hour, Dunne settled with his family out of court.
Haughey was aware that there was a widening circle of people getting access to this information that had the potential to destroy his reputation.
For 2 more years, Haughey's secret stayed hidden. Disclosure, when it came, emerged from nowhere. In November '96, a story broke that Ben Dunne had paid for an extension to the home of a Fine Gael minister.
And it was like the opening of Pandora's box. The words started going around about a bigger payment by Ben Dunne to another political figure, whom it quickly became apparent to everyone in the know was Charles Haughey.
In desperation, Haughey began to make calls to Noel Smith, Ben Dunne's solicitor.
Noel Smith kept logging the meetings, contents of those particular meetings. Haughey assumed that Smith was on his side and wanted to cover it up, but Smith's loyalty was to his client, Ben Dunne.
Within weeks, the media tentatively began to link Haughey to a £1 million payment from Ben Dunne.
He would have known that, you know, this was causing difficulties for me personally. It was obvious that he didn't want to discuss it, and that, you know, that he appeared to be in some sort of denial.
And Haughey kept denying, confident there was no evidence linking him to the money. But the net was beginning to close.
Tribunal of inquiry into the Dunne's payments affair was now imminent.
Ben Dunne, the first witness, told the payments to politicians.
Had approached Ben Dunne to raise around £900,000 to ease Mr. Haughey's
said that Mr. Haughey had said that he had never received any money from Ben Dunne.
He just insisted that Ben was lying, that he had not received any money. He decided to brazen it out.
But there was one piece of evidence that Haughey had forgotten. The bank drafts that he had received directly from Dunne at Kinseely in 1991.
So Smith went out to see Haughey. He brought with him the 3 bank drafts, and he said, "Do you know anything about these?" Haughey says, "No, I don't." And he notices Haughey's demeanour. Haughey is panicking, that he looks terrified, that he sees the whole world crashing in on top of him.
The drafts were a direct link from Dunne to Haughey. But despite all the evidence now amassed by the tribunal team, Haughey kept denying.
He told his own legal team this wasn't true. He gave them instructions on the basis, I am been wronged, I am the victim of a false allegation.
But the final blow to Haughey's defence was about to come. Noel Smith told the tribunal he had detailed logs of his conversations with Haughey.
And there it was, Haughey's denial against the lawyer's contemporaneous notes, it was game, set and match. Haughey was caught out.
The tribunal had also cracked the secret of Haughey's offshore Ansbacher accounts. He had misled his legal team and his family. He now had no choice but to come clean.
I was amazed, yeah. I had no idea. Angry, I suppose, is a strong word to use. But, I mean, let's be honest, we could have done without it now.
Shortly after 7 a.m. on the morning of the 15th of July, Charles Haughey's car slipped quietly through the gates of Dublin Castle.
And I remember speaking to a woman at the tribunal. You know, she says, I was coming to work this morning at 8 o'clock on the bus from Raheny, which is in the heart of Haughey's constituency. And she says, and the bus driver had his own little radio at the front of the bus, and they reported that Charlie Haughey had managed to evade the press and get into the castle by a big gate. And she says, everybody in the bus broke into spontaneous applause.
I thought it was incredibly poignant. And Dublin Castle itself is such an ambiguous place in our history. It's where, you know, Michael Collins arrived a few minutes late and said, well, we've waited 700 years. And in the 700 years, it was the place where many an Irishman faced his doom.
Just before 11 a.m, Haughey took the witness stand.
Here he was, stripped down, bare, unmasked. The emperor had no clothes, and had to admit that indeed he had received the money from Ben Dunn.
Afterwards, everybody was standing out in the yard. Haughey came out the main door of Dublin Castle to wave at the crowd, and some people cheered and he waved, and then everybody started booing. And you could see the shock on his face that he didn't know what to do. I mean, everything had changed.
He was very shattered. I think he felt totally betrayed by the state.
There was something slightly plaintive about the spectacle of an ordinary dub who had trusted this man absolutely and still in a sense did so. I think in one sense maybe that was Haughey's lowest moment, because it's when in a way he's confronted with the unquestioning trust of simple people whom he really has probably betrayed.
In the years to come, Haughey's humiliating fall would continue. He would face criminal charges for allegedly obstructing the tribunal, and the breathtaking scale of his reliance on businessmen would be revealed. An estimated £8.5 million over